A wealthy businessman abandoned his family for his mistress, moving her into his luxury penthouse. 1 year later, she revealed her true identity, the daughter of the business rival he'd destroyed years ago. She'd orchestrated everything as revenge, leaving him bankrupt and alone. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The penthouse suite shimmered, a gilded cage reflecting Arthur's hollow triumph. Sunlight, fractured by the city's glass canyons, sliced through the vast living room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the opulent space. He sat alone, a half-empty glass of amber liquid sweating on the polished ebony table beside him. The silence pressed down, heavy and suffocating, a stark contrast to the constant, manic energy of his former life. He traded the clamor of boardrooms for this opulent solitude, this gilded prison. A low sob escaped his lips, a sound so unexpected it startled him. He hadn't allowed himself to feel this deeply in years, not since the image of his children's faces, small and tear-streaked, flickered in his mind's eye, a stark counterpoint to Isabella's seductive smile. He swirled the remaining whiskey, the amber liquid mirroring the turmoil within. "This is what I wanted," he muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. But even as he spoke the lie, a cold dread snaked around his heart, whispering doubts he couldn't ignore. Isabella entered, a vision in silk, her smile as practiced and flawless as ever. But tonight, there was a subtle tremor in her hand as she reached for a crystal glass. The carefully constructed facade, usually impenetrable, showed a flicker of something dark and uncertain behind her eyes. She poured herself a drink, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. "Darling, you seem troubled," she purred, her voice a velvet caress that failed to soothe the growing unease in Arthur's soul. "Just thinking," he replied, his voice flat. The lie felt more comfortable than the truth. She moved closer, her perfume, a heady blend of jasmine and something sharp, almost metallic, filling the air. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch unexpectedly cold. "Don't think too much, Arthur. It's not good for you." Her words, normally a sweet poison, now held an edge of steel. He flinched, the subtle shift in her demeanor sharper than any blade. The unspoken threat hung between them, heavy and suffocating, a chilling prelude to the storm that was brewing. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of opulent silence, felt claustrophobic. The scent of Isabella's jasmine perfume, usually intoxicating, now clung to the air like a suffocating shroud. Arthur stared at the swirling whiskey, the amber liquid mocking his own turmoil. He felt a prickling unease, a premonition of impending doom that ran deeper than mere marital discord. Isabella's touch, once a sensual caress, had been icy, her smile strained. He'd seen the flicker of something dark behind her eyes, a cold calculation that chilled him to the bone. I need some air," he stammered, his voice a ragged whisper. The words felt inadequate, insufficient to express the churning fear within him. Isabella laughed, a brittle, almost hysterical sound. The crystal glass in her hand trembled slightly, a subtle tremor that betrayed her composure. "Air? Darling, you're being dramatic. It's a little chilly out tonight." He ignored her, rising to his feet. The polished ebony floor felt cold beneath his bare feet. He moved towards the expansive window, the city lights a dazzling, yet distant, spectacle. The city, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a cold, uncaring giant. He opened the window, letting the night air wash over him, a stark contrast to the stifling opulence of the penthouse. The wind whipped at his expensive suit, a cruel irony considering the precariousness of his situation. He inhaled deeply, desperately seeking a breath of fresh air, a moment of clarity in the suffocating fog of fear and uncertainty. "Arthur," Isabella's voice was laced with a chilling patience. "You know I don't appreciate your impulsiveness." The threat was unspoken, but heavy, a lead weight in the air. He turned, his gaze meeting hers. Her beauty, once captivating, now seemed like a mask, a carefully constructed facade concealing something deeply unsettling. The The subtle tremor in her hand had intensified, her knuckles white as she clutched the glass. This wasn't the playful, seductive woman he'd fallen for. This was something else entirely, something dangerous and cold. He sensed the imminent unraveling of his carefully crafted world, a world built on lies and deceit, about to crumble around him. The fear was palpable, a suffocating presence that threatened to consume him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that this night would mark the beginning of his end. The penthouse suite, usually a beacon of shimmering luxury, felt like a gilded cage. Arthur ran a hand through his thinning hair, the expensive silk of his pajamas scratching against his skin, a small irritation amidst the colossal storm brewing within him. The city lights, a breathtaking panorama from his window, held no allure tonight. They were mere pinpricks of light in the vast, indifferent darkness that seemed to mirror his own soul. Isabella, draped across the plush velvet sofa, looked like a predator resting after a successful hunt. The faint scent of jasmine clung to her, a deceptive sweetness masking the bitter truth he was beginning to grasp. Her silence was more unnerving than any outburst, a suffocating blanket of cold calculation. "Darling?" she purred, her voice a silken whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. "You seem troubled." He forced a smile, a grotesque imitation of his former charm. "Just tired, Isabella. The business, it's been demanding." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. The truth, a growing suspicion that gnawed at him, a fear that bordered on panic, felt too terrifying to utter. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Demanding? Or are you perhaps starting to regret our arrangement?" The words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. He saw the glint of steel behind the carefully crafted mask of beauty. He felt a cold sweat prickling his skin. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his escape, felt like a prison. He looked at his reflection in the polished marble surface of a side table, a stranger staring back at him, a man haunted by guilt and fear. The face was thinner, lined with worry, eyes shadowed with a weariness that years of champagne and caviar couldn't mask. "Regret? No," he said, his voice barely a breath. But the lie felt hollow even to him. His heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a desperate drumbeat of impending doom. He was trapped, ensnared by a web of deceit he himself had helped weave. The jasmine perfume, once so alluring, now seemed to carry the scent of betrayal. He had to escape, but escape to where? The crushing weight of his past misdeeds pressed down on him, suffocating him. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and the woman he'd believed was his salvation was the architect of his destruction. The city lights outside, once symbols of his power, mocked his impotence. The night was young, but for Arthur, the dawn felt impossibly distant. The next morning, sunlight sliced through the gap in the curtains, painting a harsh stripe across Arthur's face. He woke with a gasp, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to him like damp fabric. He dreamt of his children, their faces blurred with sorrow, their voices a silent scream. He flinched, pulling the silk sheets tighter, the cool material offering little comfort against the icy dread that gripped him. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of lavish indulgence, felt like a tomb. Isabella was already awake, sitting at the breakfast bar, a vision of serene composure in a silk robe the color of a summer sky. A silver coffee pot gleamed beside a plate laden with pastries that looked too perfect, too pristine, to be touched. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee battled with the lingering scent of jasmine, a strange juxtaposition of comfort and unease. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice a carefully modulated tone devoid of warmth. The carefully crafted smile didn't reach her eyes, a chilling contrast to the idyllic scene. He managed a weak smile in return, the gesture feeling stiff and unnatural. He pushed himself upright, his muscles aching from a night spent wrestling with guilt and fear. The opulent surroundings, once a source of pride, now mocked his vulnerability. "Sleep well?" she asked, her gaze unwavering, scrutinizing. "Not particularly," he admitted, his voice raspy. "I had a disturbing dream." He couldn't bring himself to articulate the truth, the terrifying vision of his abandoned family. Isabella leaned forward, her elbows resting on the polished marble countertop. Dreams are often reflections of our subconscious, Arthur. Perhaps you're wrestling with something you've been trying to avoid. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. He saw a flicker of something cold and calculating in her eyes, a momentary crack in her meticulously constructed facade. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat refusing to budge. The pastries on the plate looked suddenly nauseating. I suppose you're right, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. He pushed his plate away, the sweetness of the pastries no longer appealing. The taste of betrayal lingered, bitter and persistent. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. His carefully constructed world, once a fortress of wealth and power, was crumbling around him, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He knew with a chilling certainty that Isabella was the architect of his destruction, and the dawn was bringing not hope, but the terrifying prospect of his downfall. The city, visible through the expansive windows, felt far away, its energy and vitality a mocking reminder of his own inner chaos. The penthouse, usually a beacon of dazzling luxury, felt claustrophobic. Arthur stared at the city sprawling beneath him, a glittering tapestry of lights that offered no solace. Isabella's words echoed in his mind, a chilling premonition. He hadn't slept. The image of his children's tear-stained faces burned into his eyelids. The silk sheets, usually a comfort, felt like a suffocating shroud. He moved to the expansive window, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning guilt within him. Below, the city hummed with a life he felt increasingly detached from. He traded the chaos of his old life for this gilded cage, only to find himself trapped by a different kind of turmoil. A gentle touch on his arm startled him. Isabella stood behind him, her presence both calming and unnerving. The scent of jasmine, ever present in the penthouse, clung to her like a second skin. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice soft, almost hesitant. The change in her demeanor was subtle, yet palpable. The icy composure of the morning was gone, replaced by something vulnerable. He turned, bracing himself for another carefully calculated manipulation, but her eyes held a flicker of something else entirely. Uncertainty? Regret? I didn't mean to upset you," she said, her gaze dropping to her hands. The perfect manicure, usually a symbol of her control, seemed to tremble slightly. He saw a woman stripped bare of her usual defenses, a glimpse of the human being beneath the meticulously crafted persona. The sight both surprised and unsettled him. It's not just the dream," he confessed, his voice hoarse. "It's everything. My children." The words caught in his throat, choked by emotion. Isabella reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He flinched, expecting a sharp rebuke, a cold dismissal. Instead, he felt a surprising warmth. "I know," she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I know what you did, Arthur, and what you've lost." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken emotions. The city lights seemed to dim, the vibrant energy replaced by a somber stillness. For the first time, Arthur felt a flicker of understanding, a glimmer of empathy that pierced through the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart. The game, it seemed, was far from over. The true battle was yet to begin, a battle not of wealth and power, but of conscience and redemption. The penthouse suite, usually a symphony of polished surfaces and soft lighting, felt cold and sterile. Arthur traced the condensation on his whiskey glass, the chill mirroring the icy dread creeping into his heart. Isabella's confession hung in the air, a heavy, unspoken accusation. He hadn't slept, haunted by the memory of his children's faces, etched with a pain he had inflicted. The city lights, usually a dazzling spectacle, seemed dull and lifeless. He glanced at Isabella, curled on the chaise lounge, her usual composure shattered. The sharp angles of her jaw were softened by fatigue, her eyes shadowed with a weariness that surprised him. The jasmine scent, usually a comforting presence, now felt cloying, a reminder of the deceptive sweetness of their relationship. I never meant for this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the low hum of the city. Her words lacked the practiced precision he had come to expect, revealing a vulnerability that both intrigued and repelled him. Arthur took a long drink, the whiskey burning a path down his throat, a fiery counterpoint to the chill that gripped his soul. "This?" he echoed, his voice rough. "This isn't happening to you, Isabella. You orchestrated this. You destroyed my life." She flinched, the delicate curve of her eyebrow a fleeting sign of pain. "No," she corrected, her voice rising slightly. "I didn't destroy your life, Arthur. You did that yourself years ago." He stared at her, the full weight of her accusation settling upon him. He thought of his abandoned family, the hollow ache in his chest mirroring the emptiness he felt in his soul. The lavish penthouse, a monument to his success, now felt like a tomb. Isabella rose, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked towards him, her gaze intense, searching. "My father's company. It wasn't an accident. You deliberately sabotaged him," she said, her voice trembling slightly with barely controlled anger. "And I watched him crumble." The years melted away, revealing a raw, visceral image of a broken man. The memory of his ruthlessness, his ambition, the casual cruelty he'd inflicted, left him breathless. His gilded cage had become a prison of his own making, a testament to his avarice and self-destruction. A sob escaped Isabella's lips, a raw, unfiltered expression of years of suppressed pain. For the first time, Arthur saw not a calculating adversary, but a woman consumed by grief and revenge. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred, leaving him stranded in the wreckage of his own making. The game, indeed, was far from over. The battle for redemption had begun, and it promised to be a long and arduous one. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the city's muted hum. Arthur swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking a fragile counterpoint to the storm raging within him. Isabella's confession hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations and the bitter scent of jasmine, a perfume that now felt tainted. He saw the tremor in her hand, the way she unconsciously smoothed the silk of her dress, small gestures betraying a vulnerability at odds with her calculated revenge. You said you didn't destroy my life," he finally said, his voice a low rasp. The words felt heavy, laden with a self-awareness that was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Isabella met his gaze, her eyes, usually sparkling with icy intelligence, now clouded with a raw, unfamiliar sorrow. "I didn't," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I gave you the opportunity to see the emptiness you'd created, the ruin you'd built." He looked around the penthouse, the opulent furnishings suddenly mocking him, a testament to his misplaced priorities. The panoramic view of the city, usually a source of pride, felt like a cold, indifferent judgment. His empire, once a source of immense satisfaction, now crumbled around him like a sandcastle battered by a relentless tide. "My children," he murmured, the words a choked whisper. He saw their faces, small and hurt, etched into his memory, a constant, agonizing reminder of his betrayal. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless, visceral pain. Isabella shifted, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "I know," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "And I know. I caused you more pain." She looked away, her gaze settling on the distant cityscape, bathed in the cool light of the moon. The cold, calculating woman he'd known seemed to melt away, leaving behind a woman broken by her own actions. The silence returned, but it was different now, less accusatory, more reflective. The weight of their shared destruction pressed down on them, a heavy blanket woven from regret, betrayal, and the chilling reality of their intertwined fates. The game, as Isabella had said, was far from over. But now, a new game began, a battle not for dominance, but for redemption. The first step, however, was acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the devastation they had wrought. And that, Arthur realized with a grim acceptance, was a battle he had to fight alone. The penthouse, usually a beacon of shimmering luxury, felt like a tomb. The city lights, once a source of pride, now mocked Arthur's downfall. He stared at the swirling amber liquid in his glass, its warmth a stark contrast to the icy chill that had settled deep in his bones. Isabella sat opposite, her usual composure fractured. The jasmine perfume, once intoxicating, now clung to the air like a suffocating shroud. "My children," he whispered, the words catching in his throat, thick with unshed tears. The memory of their small, hurt faces was a fresh wound. Isabella's gaze drifted to the city sprawling beneath them. "I know," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the city's low hum. The hardness in her eyes had softened, replaced by a weariness that mirrored his own. I never wanted to hurt them. Only you." He looked at her, truly looked at her, past the carefully constructed facade of revenge. He saw the vulnerability hidden beneath layers of calculated cruelty, a vulnerability born of her own pain, her own losses. The pain she had inflicted, though, was real, unforgivable. "It wasn't just about your father's company," he said, the words a low rumble. "Was it?" He understood now, saw the twisted logic, the desperate need for retribution that fueled her actions. The game, as she had said, had been more than just business. It was a war fought on the battleground of his life. A faint tremor ran through Isabella's shoulders. "No," she admitted, her voice barely a breath. "It was about everything. Everything you took from me, from my family." She didn't need to elaborate. He knew. The years of his ruthless ambition, his callous disregard for the collateral damage, the emptiness he had created. He closed his eyes, the memories flooding back the faces of his family, the casual cruelty, the slow, agonizing erosion of their trust. His actions had repercussions that rippled through generations, and he, in his arrogance, had never seen it. He began, but the words failed him. The weight of his actions, the crushing weight of his guilt, threatened to suffocate him. Isabella reached across the chasm that separated them, her hand resting lightly on his. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation, not yet, but a shared acknowledgement of the wreckage, a silent understanding of their shared pain, the destructive consequences of their choices. The game was far from over, but the rules had changed. They were both prisoners now, trapped in the ruins of their own making. The battle for redemption had begun. The penthouse suite, usually bathed in the warm glow of sunset, was shrouded in twilight. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm raging inside Arthur. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking a mournful counterpoint to the city's relentless rhythm. Isabella watched him, her expression unreadable beneath the soft glow of a table lamp. The scent of jasmine, usually a heady perfume, now felt cloying, heavy with unspoken accusations. "It wasn't just about the money, was it?" Arthur finally asked, his voice raspy, the words tearing through the suffocating silence. He needed to understand, to grasp the monstrous engine driving Isabella's revenge. Isabella hesitated, her gaze drifting to a photograph on the mantel. A smiling family, vibrant and full of life, a life Arthur had shattered. The image, once a symbol of triumph, now mocked her victory. "My father," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He built that company from nothing. You took everything from us. His life, his legacy, everything." A sob escaped her lips, shattering the carefully constructed composure she'd maintained for so long. The vulnerability in her eyes, a flicker of raw pain beneath layers of carefully applied ice, startled Arthur. He saw the girl she once was, the life she'd lost, the future she'd been robbed of. His ruthlessness, his cold ambition, had reached far beyond the boardroom, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The rain intensified, the wind howling a mournful dirge. Arthur rose, the crystal glass trembling in his hand, the amber liquid sloshing precariously. He walked to the window, the city a dizzying labyrinth of lights below. His empire, once so vast, felt like a distant dream, a phantom of his former self. The guilt, the crushing weight of his actions, bore down on him with suffocating force. He was a ghost, inhabiting a gilded cage built on the ruins of others' lives. He turned back to Isabella, his face etched with a mixture of regret and a dawning understanding. I didn't see it," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "I was blind." The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Could anything ever truly make amends for the devastation he had wrought? The battle for redemption had only just begun. The rain continued its relentless assault, drumming a frantic rhythm against the penthouse windows. Arthur stared out at the city, a million twinkling lights blurring into an indistinguishable mass. The champagne, once celebratory, now tasted like ash. He felt the hollow ache of emptiness, a vast void where his empire once stood. Isabella sat silently, the fragile composure she'd managed to maintain for so long finally crumbling. Her shoulders trembled, slight at first, then escalating into racking sobs. I wanted to hurt you," she choked out, her voice barely audible above the storm. "To make you feel the pain, the way you made my father feel." Arthur turned, his gaze softening as he saw the raw vulnerability behind her tears. He saw not the cunning architect of his downfall, but a woman consumed by grief, a victim of his own merciless ambition. The scent of jasmine, once so alluring, now felt heavy and suffocating, a bitter reminder of his past choices. He walked towards her, the movement hesitant, as if approaching a wounded animal. He sat beside her, the plush velvet of the sofa cold beneath him. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, unsure if she would recoil. She didn't. Her fingers, slender and delicate, intertwined with his. "I understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I understand the pain you've felt. I can only imagine the emptiness, the loss." He didn't try to excuse himself to justify his actions. He knew there were no excuses. The weight of his past misdeeds bore down on him, heavy and inescapable. But revenge, it doesn't heal. Isabella looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen, her face etched with the weariness of years of carefully constructed deceit. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail through the carefully applied makeup. "It's all I had left," she whispered, her voice thick with regret. "It was all I knew how to do." The unspoken words hung in the air. It was all I could do. The full extent of her devastation slowly unfolded in the shared silence. The rain continued to fall, washing away the grime of the city, mirroring the cleansing tears that streamed down Isabella's face, and the silent confession of grief beginning to fill the space between them. The gilded cage, once a symbol of his success, felt more like a prison. A harsh reality that he'd built for himself, now shared, unexpectedly, with the woman who'd trapped him in it. The battle for redemption, for both of them, was just beginning. The penthouse, usually a beacon of opulent comfort, felt suffocating. The scent of jasmine, once a symbol of their intoxicating affair, now clung to the air like a cloying perfume, a constant reminder of their shattered reality. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm raging within Arthur. He watched Isabella, her fragile composure crumbling, the carefully constructed mask of icy control finally slipping. The trembling in her shoulders was a stark contrast to the steely gaze she usually held. I didn't want it to end like this," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, a stark admission that fractured the heavy silence. The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, a stark admission of regret that resonated deeply within Arthur. He saw the pain in her eyes, a reflection of the devastation he'd caused, not just to her, but to her family. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, suffocating him. "Neither did I," he replied, his voice hoarse with a weariness that mirrored hers. "But some mistakes, some betrayals, they leave scars that never truly heal." He moved closer, his touch tentative as he reached for her hand. her fingers cold and trembling, met his. The physical connection, despite the circumstances, offered a fragile bridge across the chasm of their shattered relationship. The rain continued its relentless assault, a mournful symphony accompanying their shared grief. The gilded cage had become their shared prison, a testament to the devastating consequences of their actions. The silence between them, however, was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken words, the shared weight of their mistakes, and the dawning realization that forgiveness, for both of them, would be a long and arduous journey. The penthouse was a mausoleum of shattered dreams. Crystal chandeliers, once sparkling symbols of Arthur's success, now seemed to mock him with their cold, glittering indifference. He sat at the grand piano, the polished ebony reflecting his haggard face, his fingers tracing the ivory keys, a silent melody of regret echoing in the opulent silence. Isabella paced restlessly, the plush Persian rug muffling her footsteps, yet unable to muffle the turmoil within her. The scent of lilies, a stark contrast to the jasmine of their earlier days, filled the air, their fragile beauty a fragile parallel to her crumbling composure. "It's not just about the money, Arthur," she said, her voice tight, betraying the carefully constructed composure she'd maintained for so long. The tremor in her voice was a crack in her formidable facade. It's about everything we destroyed." Arthur looked up, his eyes, dark and weary, met hers. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, a relentless percussion to their unspoken accusations and shared guilt. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, buried beneath layers of anger and regret. He knew the fear wasn't just for the consequences of her actions, but for the exposure of her carefully crafted revenge. He pushed himself away from the piano, the movement slow and deliberate, the weight of his actions heavy on his shoulders. "I know," he said, his voice rough, worn down by the year of deception and the weight of his past. "I destroyed your family, and in doing so, I destroyed myself." Isabella stopped pacing, her back to him, her shoulders shaking slightly. The carefully constructed composure was finally dissolving, leaving raw vulnerability in its place. The silence stretched between them, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from regret and unspoken accusations. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, a dazzling spectacle of indifference to their private devastation. The opulent room suddenly felt claustrophobic, a gilded cage confining them to their shared sorrow. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a testament to the devastating consequences of their choices and the long, arduous journey towards any possibility of forgiveness. The rain hammered against the panoramic windows, a relentless rhythm mirroring the turmoil in Arthur's gut. He stared at the city lights, a dazzling, indifferent spectacle. The penthouse, once a symbol of his triumph, now felt like a tomb. Isabella stood by the fireplace, the flickering flames illuminating the tremor in her hands. The scent of lilies, sharp and cold, clashed with the lingering memory of jasmine, a ghost of their earlier, deceitful paradise. "It wasn't just about revenge," Isabella finally said, her voice barely a whisper, cracking under the weight of unspoken truths. "It was about reclaiming what was stolen." Arthur turned, his gaze lingering on her face, etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. He saw a flicker of something other than cold calculation in her eyes, a hint of vulnerability, buried deep beneath layers of carefully constructed anger. The opulent setting felt suffocating, the gilded cage shrinking around them. "My actions had consequences," he admitted, his voice rough, the words catching in his throat. "I hurt your family, and now, I've destroyed myself." The confession wasn't just about his financial ruin. It was about the devastation of his soul. A silence fell between them, heavy and thick, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Isabella moved towards the window, her back to him. He saw the faint shudder of her shoulders, a silent confession of her own pain. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling, revealing the fragile woman beneath. The rain continued its relentless assault, washing away the illusion of their perfect life. The city lights, once a beacon of his success, now seemed to mock his failure. The silence held the weight of their shared guilt, the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air. He watched her, a woman consumed by her own carefully orchestrated revenge, now facing the bitter consequences of her actions. A new understanding was dawning, a recognition of the shared devastation they had wrought. The path to forgiveness was long and arduous, but for the first time, a glimmer of hope flickered in the darkness. The weight of their shared past was immense, but the unspoken promise of a future, however uncertain, began to take shape. The rain continued its relentless assault, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the vast expanse of glass. Inside, the penthouse felt colder than the storm raging outside. The lilies, their fragrance cloying and artificial, did little to mask the lingering scent of jasmine, a phantom perfume from a life that now felt like a fever dream. Arthur ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture a tired, familiar ritual. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, the opulent bed a monument to his sleepless nights. Isabella remained by the window, her silhouette stark against the city's glittering expanse. The city that once held such promise now seemed to mock him with its indifferent beauty. The silence between them was thick with unspoken accusations, a heavy blanket woven from shared guilt and regret. I didn't understand," Arthur finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain. The words felt inadequate, pathetic in the face of the devastation he'd wrought. Isabella turned slowly, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. The carefully constructed mask of icy revenge had begun to crack, revealing the pain beneath. "You never did," she replied, her voice a low murmur, heavy with years of suppressed anger and hurt. "You took everything from my family, and you never even saw it." He saw the tears welling in her eyes, tears she stubbornly refused to let fall. They were tears not just of revenge fulfilled, but of a lifetime of loss, a lifetime shadowed by his ambition and ruthlessness. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had not only destroyed her family's business, he had destroyed her life, leaving her with nothing but the ashes of her past. He saw the young girl in her eyes now, a girl who deserved so much more. "And you destroyed me too," Arthur said, his voice raw with pain. The confession wasn't just about his financial ruin. It was about the hollow emptiness that had replaced the joy he'd once found in his life. The children, his children who now viewed him as a stranger, were the greatest loss of all. His former wife, with her quiet dignity, was a constant reminder of the life he'd thrown away. A long silence descended, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of success, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping them both in a prison of their own making. The city lights, once a beacon of his triumph, now mocked his failure, a constant reminder of his colossal mistake. The weight of their shared past was immense, yet within that weight, the faint glimmer of a fragile, uncertain future emerged. The path to forgiveness would be long, arduous, and filled with obstacles, but for the first time, a sliver of hope pierced the darkness. The rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the tempest in Arthur's soul. He stared at his reflection, a gaunt, hollowed-out version of the man who'd once commanded boardrooms with effortless charm. The penthouse, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a mausoleum. Isabella sat across from him, the pale light catching the sharp angles of her face, highlighting the fatigue etched beneath the meticulously applied makeup. The jasmine scent, a cruel reminder of their ill-fated romance, clung to the air. "It wasn't just the business, was it?" Arthur finally broke the suffocating silence, his voice a hoarse whisper. He watched her, searching for any flicker of the alluring woman who had captivated him a year ago. Only the ghost of that woman remained. Isabella's gaze drifted to the cityscape, its glittering lights a stark contrast to the darkness clouding her eyes. "My father, he built that empire brick by brick. You took it from him, stole his life's work, leaving my mother heartbroken and me, nothing." Her voice was flat, devoid of the theatrical venom he'd expected. It was the weary voice of someone carrying a burden far too heavy. Arthur flinched. He knew the details, the ruthless tactics he'd employed to outmaneuver his rival. He justified it then as necessary ambition, a climb to the top, whatever the cost. Now, the cost was laid bare, devastating in its totality. He saw the girl Isabella had been, the bright future she'd possessed, stolen by his cold, calculated ambition. Guilt, sharp and unforgiving, clawed at his throat. He reached for a glass of amber liquid, his hand trembling. The ice clinked softly, a fragile counterpoint to the storm raging outside and within him. I can't undo it," he managed, the words catching in his throat. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His wealth, his status, all the trappings of success meant nothing against the wreckage of their lives. Isabella turned, her eyes finally meeting his. There was a trace of something else in them now, not just anger, but a deep, aching loneliness. "Revenge," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "was a hollow victory. It left me empty." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a tear of regret, a tear of profound loss, a tear that spoke volumes more than her carefully constructed facade ever could. The rain continued its relentless assault, a soundtrack to their shared despair, a symphony of regret echoing through the opulent, yet chillingly empty, penthouse. The penthouse, usually a beacon of glittering luxury, felt claustrophobic. Arthur paced, the Persian rug soft beneath his worn slippers, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked windows. He could almost hear the rhythmic thump of his own heart, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Isabella sat rigidly on the chaise lounge, a stark white sculpture against the dark leather. The air, thick with the scent of jasmine and unspoken accusations, crackled with tension. "It's not just the money," Arthur finally said, his voice rough, the words catching in his throat. He stopped pacing, the movement abruptly ceasing, leaving him feeling stranded in the vast emptiness of the room. He needed to understand, to grasp the full measure of his failure. Isabella didn't turn. The city lights painted fleeting reflections in her eyes, masking any emotion. "It's everything," she finally whispered, her voice a low murmur barely audible above the drumming rain. "The years of my life stolen, the future I lost, my father's legacy destroyed." A bitter laugh escaped Arthur's lips. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying his weariness. I thought I was building something." He stared at his reflection, once again seeing the gaunt image staring back at him. Success, a legacy. His voice was thick with self-loathing. Isabella turned, her gaze piercing, sharp as shards of glass. "You built your success on the ruins of my family's life. You thought you could erase us, replace us, without consequence." Her voice rose slightly, a hint of the carefully controlled fury he knew too well simmering beneath the surface. He flinched, the memory of his ruthless tactics, the calculated maneuvers that had brought down her father's company, a fresh wound. The guilt was a physical weight crushing him. He saw the pain in her eyes, the deep-seated anger, and beneath it, something more, a profound emptiness. He wondered if he had ever really seen her, beyond the carefully constructed facade she'd presented to him. I didn't." He struggled for the words, the justifications he'd rehearsed countless times falling flat, tasteless, meaningless. The opulent apartment, the symbols of his ill-gotten gains, felt cold and empty, a stark reminder of his hollow victory. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, a mournful counterpoint to the silence between them, a silence heavy with the weight of shared regret, a shared burden of loss. The unspoken words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, a stark reminder of the shattered lives they both had helped to create. The truth, cruel and unforgiving, lay starkly between them. The rain hammered against the penthouse windows, a relentless percussion accompanying the unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air. Rain-laden clouds outside. A silence fell, broken only by the storm, a silence pregnant with the possibility of forgiveness, however remote. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the relentless drumming of rain against the panoramic windows. The city lights, blurred and distorted by the downpour, seemed to mock their opulent prison. Arthur felt the chill seep into his bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the storm. He looked at Isabella, her face pale and drawn under the harsh glare of the city lights, the expensive silk of her robe doing little to disguise the tremor in her hands. The lilies, once a symbol of their intoxicating romance, now felt like a suffocating shroud. "Justice?" he repeated softly, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "You wanted justice for your father. But what about the justice for my family? For the hurt I caused them?" His voice was low, a confession more than an accusation. Isabella didn't answer immediately. She stared at the swirling amber liquid in her glass, the ice clinking a fragile counterpoint to the tempest raging outside. The city sprawled below, a glittering tapestry of lights and shadows, yet it felt a million miles away, disconnected from the raw emotion that filled the penthouse. A tear escaped, tracing a glistening path down her cheek, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed mask she'd worn for so long. The strength in her gaze faltered, replaced by a vulnerability that both frightened and captivated Arthur. He saw a flicker of regret, a shadow of the girl she might have been, before the weight of revenge had consumed her. He reached for her hand again, his touch gentler this time, a tentative bridge across the chasm of their betrayal. This time she didn't pull away. Her fingers, cold and trembling, intertwined with his. I didn't realize," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I didn't see." Her voice trailed off, lost in the tempest of their shared guilt. The weight of her actions, the magnitude of her revenge, seemed to finally crush her carefully constructed facade. The rain continued its relentless assault, a symphony of destruction mirroring the wreckage of their lives. The penthouse, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a tomb, heavy with the unspoken words, the unacknowledged pain. Arthur squeezed her hand, a silent promise of shared burden, a fragile hope for something more than the devastation that surrounded them. The storm raged on, but within the confines of the opulent penthouse, a different kind of storm was brewing, a storm of remorse, of regret, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of forgiveness. The penthouse, usually a beacon of glittering luxury, felt claustrophobic. Rain lashed against the windows, mirroring the tempest in Arthur's soul. He watched Isabella, her carefully constructed composure finally crumbling. The expensive silk of her robe couldn't hide the tremor in her hands, the hollows deepening under her eyes. The lilies, symbols of their poisonous romance, wilted in a crystal vase, their fragrance now cloying and suffocating. "It wasn't just revenge," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "It was about proving something, to myself, to him." Her gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a younger, smiling Isabella with a man whose face was now familiarly etched in Arthur's memory. A face he'd ruthlessly erased from the business world years ago. Arthur felt a surge of something akin to pity, not for her privileged background, but for the lost girl hidden beneath layers of calculated cruelty. "Proving what?" he asked, his voice rough with unshed tears. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations and buried regrets. She swallowed, the movement a visible struggle. "That I wasn't just a pawn, that I could control my own destiny." A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, a stark contrast to her usually flawless makeup. The strength that had held her together for so long, the icy determination, fractured. Her carefully sculpted mask of invincibility shattered. He saw the fear behind the defiance, the raw vulnerability that had been meticulously concealed. He reached out, his touch hesitant, unsure. He saw a flicker of hope, a fragile spark in the darkness of her soul. "But at what cost?" he murmured, his voice thick with remorse. "You destroyed everything. You destroyed me, yes, but more importantly, you destroyed yourself." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain. The city lights below seemed to mock their opulent misery, their glittering indifference a harsh counterpoint to their shared despair. The weight of their actions, the crushing burden of their choices, pressed down on them, suffocating. The lilies, once symbols of a deceitful romance, now seemed to embody the decay of their lives, the poisonous bloom of their revenge. The storm raged on, both outside and within, but within the opulent confines of their gilded cage, a faint glimmer of something else emerged. The chilling realization that revenge had delivered them both to a desolate and lonely place, one far colder than the winter storm raging outside. The next morning dawned gray and bleak, mirroring the state of Arthur's finances. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a mausoleum. The scent of lilies, yesterday so cloying, was gone, replaced by the sterile tang of cleaning products. Isabella was gone too, leaving behind only a note, a curt farewell, devoid of remorse. He found it on the marble bathroom counter, a stark white rectangle against the polished surface, a final, cold punctuation mark to their disastrous affair. He picked it up, the paper crisp and unforgiving under his trembling fingers. The words were few, stark, and brutally efficient, outlining the legal steps she'd taken to secure her newfound wealth, her claim on his former empire. There was no apology, no explanation beyond the chilling statement, "Consider this justice." He crumpled the note, the paper tearing easily in his clenched fist. He stared at the fragments, tiny pieces of shattered dreams, and a wave of nausea washed over him. The opulent emptiness of the penthouse pressed down on him, suffocating him. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a vast emptiness that no amount of money could ever fill. He stumbled to the window, the cityscape sprawling beneath him, a dizzying panorama of indifference. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a bruised purple, mirroring the darkness that had settled deep within him. He thought of his children, their faces blurred by time and guilt, their voices a distant echo in the cavern of his memory. He hadn't even tried to contact them since Isabella's arrival. Fear, then self-preservation, had kept him silent. Now only crushing regret remained. A shard of memory pierced the fog of his despair. The frightened eyes of Isabella's father years ago, as Arthur's ruthless business tactics had driven him to the brink of ruin. The image was a vivid, searing brand on his conscience. The man's despair, a mirror reflecting his own present desolation. He'd forgotten the human cost, blinded by ambition and avarice. He sank to his knees, the coldness of the marble seeping into his bones. The luxury that had once defined his life now felt like a cruel mockery, a gilded cage that had trapped him in his own self-made hell. The silence of the penthouse was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the city far below, a relentless symphony of indifference to his personal apocalypse. He was alone, stripped bare of everything: his wealth, his lover, his family, and most importantly, his self-respect. The full weight of his actions, the consequences of his choices, crashed down on him, leaving him broken, utterly and completely alone. The legal papers arrived like icy daggers, each one a precise thrust into Arthur's already shattered heart. He stared at the elegant script, the formal language mocking his downfall. His empire, built on ambition and ruthlessness, was now rubble. The penthouse, once a symbol of triumph, felt like a prison. The faint scent of lilies, a ghost of Isabella, clung stubbornly to the air, a bitter reminder of his folly. He sank into a leather chair, the supple hide cold against his skin. The city lights blurred through the panoramic windows, a shimmering tapestry of indifference. His phone lay silent, a monument to his isolation. He hadn't spoken to his children, his wife, not since the beginning of the end. A flicker of memory, his daughter's tear-stained face, her small hand clutching his. He dismissed her fears as childish whims, his ambition a blinding force. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless tide eroding his already fragile composure. He found a half-empty bottle of expensive scotch, the amber liquid mocking his opulent misery. He poured himself a generous measure, the ice clinking a mournful rhythm against the glass. He swallowed, the burn of fleeting comfort against the icy grip of despair. A knock at the door. His lawyer. The man looked weary, his face etched with professional sympathy. "The assets are gone, Mr. Blackwood. There's little left." "I know," Arthur rasped, his voice rough with disuse. The words were a hollow echo in the vast space of the apartment. He felt a profound emptiness, a void that even the finest scotch couldn't fill. He didn't need the lawyer to confirm what he already knew. He was ruined. Not just financially, but spiritually, emotionally, utterly. The opulent cage had finally sprung, leaving him exposed to the harsh reality of his self-destruction. The silence that followed was a crushing weight, the finality of his defeat settling like a shroud. The lawyer's departure left a silence heavier than the opulent furnishings. Arthur stared at the empty Scotch glass. The ice melted, a pathetic puddle mirroring the state of his life. He hadn't felt this hollow since. He couldn't even remember. The penthouse, once a symbol of success, now felt like a mausoleum. The city lights, once a dazzling spectacle, were now a cold, indifferent glare. He rose, the movement slow, deliberate, each step heavy with the weight of his failure. He walked to the panoramic window, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning shame within. Below, the city throbbed, oblivious to his plight. A lone car horn blared, a discordant note in the symphony of urban life. Felt like a personal insult. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the touch revealing the exhaustion etched into his face. He was a ruin, a monument to his own hubris. The guilt, a relentless companion, tightened its grip. He thought of his children, their faces blurred by the haze of his self-imposed exile. The memory of his daughter's tear-stained face, her small hand clutching his, stabbed him with fresh pain. A choked sob escaped his lips. He hadn't cried in years, not since before Isabella, before the gilded cage had sprung shut. He slumped against the window, the cool glass a momentary solace against the fiery shame. He saw a flicker of movement below, a small, solitary figure, a woman, sitting on a bench in the park across the street. She looked familiar, the way she hunched over, her shoulders trembling slightly. A wave of nausea washed over him. The woman lifted her face, and Arthur gasped. It was his wife, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in a year. The sight of her, so small and vulnerable, broke through the icy shell of his despair. The loneliness, the crushing weight of his isolation, intensified. He wanted to reach out, to beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat. He could only watch, a silent spectator to her quiet grief, a mirroring of his own. The city lights seemed to dim, the vibrant tapestry fading into a gray, desolate landscape. His downfall felt complete, irreversible. But in that moment, seeing his wife, a tiny spark of hope ignited, a fragile ember in the ashes of his ruin. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden. The city seemed to hold its breath. The next morning, the city's relentless hum seemed to mock Arthur's quiet despair. He woke to the sterile scent of the penthouse, a stark contrast to the lingering image of Sarah, her fragility a painful indictment of his choices. He lay there, the crisp cotton sheets cool against his skin, the emptiness beside him a vast, echoing space. He hadn't slept, the city lights a hypnotic torment. He showered, the hot water failing to wash away the grime of his guilt. The reflection staring back was a stranger gaunt, eyes shadowed, the once sharp features softened by defeat. He dressed mechanically, the expensive suit feeling like a costume. A knock. He braced himself. It was his lawyer, Mr. Davies, his face etched with professional concern, but a hint of something else. Pity? Contempt? The creditors are impatient, Mr. Blackwood. Davies began, his voice low, the words precise, surgically cutting through the silence. They're demanding immediate action. Liquidation is imminent. Arthur felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew this was coming, but the actual pronouncement hit him like a physical blow. He sat down heavily on a plush chair, the plushness suddenly mocking. The opulent surroundings felt claustrophobic, the gilded cage now a prison. "There's nothing left?" he managed, his voice a rasp. Davies shifted uncomfortably. "I've done everything I can, sir. But the losses, they were catastrophic. Your investments, the questionable dealings." He didn't need to finish. Arthur knew exactly which questionable dealings Davies alluded to. The ones that had fueled his empire, the ones built on the ruins of Isabella's father's company. The irony was sickening. "Isabella," he whispered, the name a bitter taste in his mouth. His voice was barely audible, a prayer lost in the vast emptiness of the room. The lawyer's silence was a confirmation. Everything was crumbling. His empire, his pride, his carefully constructed life, all reduced to dust. The weight of his choices pressed down, heavy and unforgiving. He closed his eyes, the city's muffled roar a fitting soundtrack to his ruin. The image of Sarah, her quiet grief, haunted him. He was alone, utterly, irrevocably alone. The cold fear that gripped him was not just for his financial ruin, but for the loss of everything that truly mattered. The lawyer's departure left a silence heavier than the city's noise. Arthur stared at the polished mahogany desk, its immaculate surface a cruel reflection of his shattered life. The scent of expensive leather and old money clung to the air, a suffocating perfume of his past success, now a mocking reminder of his utter failure. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the starkness of his gaunt face. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a tomb. A faint tremor ran through the floor. It wasn't the city. It was the sound of Isabella's heels clicking on the marble floor. He braced himself. She entered, her usual flawless composure subtly altered. A flicker of something unease, triumph tinged with something darker, played across her lips. She carried herself with a newfound authority, radiating the power she'd so ruthlessly seized. "Well, Arthur," she began, her voice a silken whisper that carried a chilling edge. The soft light from the cityscape illuminated her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the unwavering glint in her eyes. "It seems my revenge is complete." He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the expensive rug beneath his feet, its intricate design mirroring the complex web she'd woven around him. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of a broken life. "You thought you could escape the consequences of your actions," she continued, her voice gaining strength. She moved closer, her presence a suffocating wave. "You destroyed my father, leaving my family destitute. You thought your money, your power, could shield you from the consequences. You were wrong." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was no hatred, no anger, only a profound emptiness. "You did this," he whispered, the words barely audible above the city's murmur. "All of this." Isabella's expression softened fractionally, a fleeting glimpse of something akin to sorrow crossing her face before it hardened again. "It was justice, Arthur, for the suffering you inflicted on my family." She paused, her gaze softening for a moment only to sharpen again. "You left my family with nothing, and now so do you." The cold realization hit him then, a wave of despair so overwhelming it threatened to drown him. It wasn't just the money, the empire, the power. It was the utter desolation, the crushing loneliness. He was alone, stripped bare, his carefully constructed world reduced to rubble. The opulent penthouse, the symbol of his success, had become his gilded cage, and his escape had been his ruin. The city's noise, once a background hum, now seemed to shriek his isolation. His revenge, her revenge, had left them both utterly broken. The champagne flute, still half full, felt like a mockery in Arthur's trembling hand. The city lights, a shimmering tapestry below, offered no solace. He stared, unseeing, at the glittering expanse, the cold glass a chilling contrast to the burning shame consuming him. Isabella's words echoed in the cavernous space of the penthouse. "It was justice, Arthur. Justice." The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He swirled the champagne, the bubbles a frantic mimicry of the turmoil within him. He'd built his empire on ruthlessness, on the calculated destruction of his rivals. He justified it as ambition, as necessary for survival. But now, stripped bare, the hollowness of his success echoed the emptiness in his soul. The meticulously crafted life he'd built, the perfect facade, had crumbled, leaving behind only the bitter taste of regret. A soft knock sounded on the door. He didn't answer. Another knock, more insistent this time. He knew it was Isabella. He didn't want to face her, didn't want to see the cold triumph in her eyes. But the silence, the suffocating solitude, was worse. He swallowed, the champagne burning a path down his throat. "Come in," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. The door opened, revealing Isabella silhouetted against the city's glow. She didn't speak, but her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, held a flicker of something he couldn't decipher. Vulnerability? Regret? He couldn't be certain. She closed the door softly, the sound a muted punctuation to the silence. The only other sound was the faint hum of the city far below. She approached slowly, her movements graceful, yet heavy with unspoken weight. She stopped before him, her gaze intense. The opulent penthouse, usually a stage for their elaborate charade, now felt like a battleground, the silence charged with unspoken accusations. I didn't realize," she began, her voice barely audible, a stark contrast to her earlier pronouncements. The words hung in the air, unfinished, frail. He saw a tear track a path down her cheek, unnoticed, unacknowledged. "Realize what?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. The knowledge that her revenge, complete as it was, hadn't brought her the satisfaction she craved, that their roles had reversed. He was the broken man, and she, the architect of his downfall, was now wrestling with her own demons. The city lights shimmered, casting long shadows, blurring the lines between victor and vanquished. Their intricate dance of revenge had left them both wounded, utterly and irrevocably changed. The silence stretched, a profound and painful testament to their shared destruction. "It was my father's company," Isabella finally whispered, the words catching in her throat. The city lights reflected in her tear-filled eyes, transforming them into pools of shimmering sorrow. The champagne flute, forgotten in Arthur's trembling hand, felt heavy, a symbol of all that was lost. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of their twisted game, now felt like a tomb. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Arthur watched her, the sharp angles of her face softened by the pain etched into her features. The calculated coldness that had defined her for so long had fractured, revealing a vulnerability that was both terrifying and strangely compelling. "You destroyed him," he said, his voice barely above a breath. The accusation hung in the air, yet it lacked the venom it once held. He saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a shared understanding of the wreckage they'd created. She nodded slowly, the movement small, almost imperceptible. "And you destroyed my mother. Years of planning. It was all I could think of." Her voice was a broken melody, raw with regret. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail against the sharp angles of her jawline. The bitter taste of his own actions clawed at him. He had justified his ruthlessness, his ambition, as necessities for success. But now, standing before the woman he'd hurt, the weight of those choices crushed him. The penthouse felt smaller, the air thinner, each breath a struggle. He looked at the city spread out beneath them, a glittering panorama of ambition and aspiration. He'd sought that glitter, that success, only to find it devoid of warmth, a cold and empty prize. Isabella stepped closer, her movements deliberate yet hesitant. The scent of her perfume, once intoxicating, was now tinged with the metallic scent of tears. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing lightly against his. I didn't want this," she choked out, her voice laced with a desperation that mirrored his own. The city lights flickered, their brilliance mirroring the fragility of their shared moment. The revenge she'd meticulously planned, the satisfaction she'd anticipated, had evaporated, leaving behind only a stark emptiness. The silence returned, softer this time. A space filled not with accusation, but with a shared recognition of their ruined lives, their collective failure. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of Arthur's success, now stood as a stark testament to their intertwined destruction. The bitter taste of their intertwined destinies lingered, a promise of a long and difficult road ahead. The champagne, forgotten and flat, sat sweating on the polished onyx table. The city lights, a million glittering pinpricks, mocked Arthur's hollow triumph. Isabella, her carefully constructed facade shattered, looked smaller, more vulnerable than he'd ever imagined. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his conquest, now felt like a prison. He watched her, the sharp angles of her face softened by unshed tears. "My father," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's hum. "You destroyed him." The words weren't an accusation. They were a lament. A shared sorrow hung heavy in the air, thicker than the expensive Persian rug beneath their feet. Arthur felt the familiar sting of guilt, sharper now, amplified by the raw honesty in her eyes. He'd built his empire on the ruins of others, justifying his actions with the cold logic of success. Now, success felt like ashes in his mouth. He saw a flicker of something akin to regret in her eyes, a reflection of his own self-loathing. The carefully planned revenge, the years of meticulous plotting, seemed to have dissolved into a bitter, unsatisfying emptiness. He reached out, a hesitant gesture mirroring her own earlier tentative touch. His fingers brushed hers, a silent acknowledgement of their shared wreckage. The coldness that had separated them for so long melted away, replaced by a chilling understanding of their intertwined ruin. "And my mother," she continued, her voice catching, "you took everything from her." The city lights blurred through his tears, the glittering panorama transforming into a hazy, indistinct landscape of his own making. He had traded genuine connection for fleeting satisfaction. He'd prioritized wealth over family, only to find himself utterly alone. The price of his ambition was his own soul. The silence stretched, filled only with the weight of their shared culpability. The opulent penthouse, a gilded cage, held not triumph, but the haunting echo of their broken lives. The bitter taste of their intertwined destruction lingered on his tongue. The road ahead promised only a long, arduous journey toward redemption, a path they would have to tread together, despite the damage they had inflicted upon each other and those they had both hurt. The penthouse, a monument to Arthur's fallen ambition, felt colder than the January wind howling outside. The opulent furnishings, once symbols of success, now mocked him with their silent extravagance. Isabella sat hunched on the edge of a velvet chaise lounge, the expensive fabric swallowed by the vast emptiness of the room. The city lights, blurred through his tears, cast long, distorted shadows. He sank onto a nearby sofa, the plush cushions offering no comfort. "My father's business," she whispered, her voice brittle. "It wasn't just business, Arthur. It was his life, his legacy." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. He nodded, the movement a physical manifestation of his crushing guilt. He couldn't speak, the weight of his actions too immense to articulate. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock, its steady beat a stark contrast to the chaos within him. He saw a tremor in her hand, a fleeting vulnerability that pierced the carefully constructed wall of her revenge. The years of planning, the meticulous execution of her plan, had left her hollow. He understood. He felt the same emptiness, the same gnawing sense of loss. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat, choked by a mixture of shame and despair. He'd built his empire on lies and deceit, and now it lay in ruins around him, a testament to his flawed character. A single tear escaped Isabella's eye, tracing a path through the expertly applied makeup, a stark contrast to her usually flawless composure. It was a tear not of victory, but of profound sadness. "And my mother," she added, her voice barely a breath. "She never recovered." The revelation, the culmination of years of carefully plotted revenge, felt strangely anticlimactic. The hollow satisfaction of victory had curdled into bitter regret. They sat in silence, the shared wreckage of their lives a tangible presence between them, heavier than the opulent furnishings surrounding them, a testament to the devastating consequences of their actions. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his ambition, now stood as a monument to their mutual ruin. The path to redemption, it seemed, would be long and arduous, a journey they would have to take together. The biting January wind rattled the penthouse windows, a counterpoint to the suffocating silence that had settled between them. Arthur, his tailored suit rumpled, stared at the cityscape sprawling below, its glittering lights mocking his ruin. The champagne flutes, remnants of a celebration that had turned to ash, lay abandoned on the polished mahogany table. He felt the chill seep into his bones, a physical manifestation of the emptiness that consumed him. Isabella, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking, traced the rim of a half-empty glass with a trembling finger. The expensive makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion etched onto her face, the stark contrast between her meticulously styled appearance and her inner turmoil palpable. It wasn't just about revenge, she whispered, her voice hoarse, the carefully rehearsed lines dissolving into raw emotion. It was about justice. He looked at her, truly saw her for the first time since their whirlwind romance began. The captivating allure had vanished, replaced by a haunted vulnerability that mirrored his own despair. He saw a young woman burdened by a past he had helped create, a woman whose carefully constructed revenge had ultimately destroyed her as much as it had him. Justice? He echoed, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. You destroyed my life, Isabella. And for what? She flinched at his harsh tone, her eyes filling with unshed tears. The years of meticulous planning, the unwavering dedication to her vengeful scheme, seemed to crumble before the raw weight of his accusation. The carefully crafted facade of strength she had maintained throughout their relationship shattered into fragments of pain and regret. A wave of nausea washed over Arthur. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage of his own making. The city lights, once a dazzling spectacle, now seemed cold and indifferent to his plight. He had lived a life of superficial success, blind to the devastating consequences of his actions. Isabella rose, her movements stiff and unsteady. She walked towards the panoramic window, her back to him, her shoulders shaking subtly. He watched her, a mixture of pity and remorse churning within him. He hadn't simply lost his empire. He'd lost himself. He'd lost his family, his dignity, his very soul. And in losing them, he'd inadvertently destroyed Isabella too. The silence stretched, heavy with the unspoken regrets and the chilling realization that their destinies were irrevocably intertwined, bound together by a web of deceit, betrayal, and ultimately, shared ruin. The dawn, breaking over the horizon, offered no solace, only the cold promise of a new day in a world irrevocably altered by their actions. The penthouse, once a symbol of Arthur's untouchable wealth, now felt like a tomb. Empty champagne flutes mocked the hollow victory Isabella had claimed. The city lights, once alluring, now seemed distant and cold, mirroring the icy chasm between them. He watched her, her back to him, the expensive silk of her dress unable to conceal the tremors running through her. It wasn't purely revenge, she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind howling outside. There was a need for justice. For my father. Arthur's gaze dropped to his hands, calloused for the first time in years. The luxury of his life had shielded him from the true consequences of his actions, a life built on the ruins of others. He'd seen his reflection in Isabella's eyes, the chilling, deliberate cruelty of his past deeds. He'd forced his father into bankruptcy, leaving a trail of broken dreams and shattered families in his wake. The taste of bitter regret filled his mouth, acrid and consuming. Justice? He repeated, the word grating. You destroyed everything, Isabella. My children, my wife, my life. He rose, the plush carpet feeling strangely alien under his feet. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, a crushing burden. Isabella turned, her face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and something akin to fear. The carefully constructed mask of the vengeful daughter had slipped, revealing a raw, wounded woman. Her eyes, once blazing with anger, now held a haunting sadness. I didn't want this," she choked out, a single tear tracing a path through the meticulously applied makeup. "I wanted to make you feel what my family felt." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. The biting wind seemed to intensify, mirroring the storm raging within them both. Arthur saw her pain, understood it, not as an excuse but as a shared burden of devastation. The opulent penthouse, the symbol of his ambition and self-destruction, shrunk around them, its grandeur no match for the raw human suffering that filled the space. The dawn approached, promising nothing but the long, difficult road to reconciliation and the daunting task of rebuilding lives shattered by revenge. The ruins of their past, a stark testament to their mutual destruction, laid before them. The silence that followed held the unspoken promise of change, however slow and arduous it might be. The opulent penthouse, usually a sanctuary of comfort, felt claustrophobic. Arthur sank onto a plush armchair, the silk cushions offering no solace. The city outside, a glittering tapestry of lights, felt a million miles away. He tasted ash in his mouth, the metallic tang of ruin. Isabella stood by the window, her silhouette a fragile thing against the vast panorama. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and the ghosts of shattered dreams. "My father," Arthur began, his voice raspy, the words catching in his throat. He watched her shoulders tremble, the carefully constructed composure finally crumbling. He saw not the vengeful daughter, but a woman broken by the weight of her actions, a mirror to his own self-destruction. "He was a good man," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "He built his company from nothing with his own two hands. You took it all from him, destroyed everything he worked for." The words were not an excuse, but a raw confession of the pain that had fueled her revenge. The grief in her voice pierced him, a sharp stab of empathy cutting through his self-pity. He had been so consumed by his own pain, his own fall from grace, that he hadn't seen hers. He'd only seen the weaponized rage, the calculated destruction. He hadn't seen the daughter grieving for a father. He rose and walked towards her, the movement hesitant, uncertain. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm before dropping to his side. The gesture, as much as the unspoken words, carried the weight of his remorse. "I know," he said, his voice barely a breath. "I understand. I'm sorry." The apology was clumsy, inadequate, but genuine. It was the first step, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their mutual destruction. The city lights flickered outside, a silent witness to the raw emotion unfolding between them. The dawn, a faint promise on the horizon, hinted at a future shrouded in uncertainty, yet strangely, not devoid of hope. The ruins of their past, a stark reminder of their folly, now stood as a foundation for a fragile new beginning. The following morning, the penthouse felt less like a gilded cage and more like a mausoleum. Sunlight, usually a welcome guest, sliced through the sheer curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent air. The champagne flutes from the previous night remained, ghostly reminders of a celebration that had turned to ash. Arthur sat at the expansive dining table, the polished mahogany reflecting his haggard face. He hadn't slept, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. The city hummed below, a symphony of indifference. Isabella wasn't there. Her absence was a palpable thing, heavier than any presence. He found a single wilted red rose on his plate, its crimson petals a stark contrast to the sterile white tablecloth. A silent message, a final, cruel flourish. He picked it up, its delicate fragility mirroring his own shattered state. His phone buzzed, a jarring interruption to the oppressive silence. It was his lawyer, Mr. Finch, his voice tight with grim efficiency. "Mr. Beaumont, the creditors are moving swiftly. We've lost everything. There's nothing left to salvage." The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow. Arthur felt a cold dread creep into his bones, a chilling certainty that encompassed not just financial ruin, but the complete dismantling of his life. His carefully constructed world, built on ambition and deceit, had been reduced to rubble. He moved like a ghost through the cavernous apartment, gathering a few belongings. A worn photograph of his children, their smiling faces a painful reminder of his failures. A simple silver pen, a gift from his father, a testament to a legacy he'd betrayed. These few mementos were all that remained of a life once overflowing with luxury and power. He felt the icy grip of despair tighten around his heart. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, was now a tomb, echoing with the silence of his defeat. He left the apartment, the door closing behind him with a finality that mirrored the closing of a chapter on his life. He walked away from the wreckage of his ambition, towards an uncertain future, carrying only the weight of his remorse and the fragile hope of redemption. The lawyer's words echoed in the empty elevator, a relentless drone against the polished steel walls. Arthur stared at his reflection, a gaunt stranger with eyes that held the weight of 1,000 regrets. The city lights blurred through the descending car, a dizzying spectacle that mirrored the chaos within him. Reaching the ground floor, he stepped into the cool night air, the sharp bite of the wind a welcome sting against his numbed skin. He walked aimlessly, the city a labyrinth of indifferent faces and flashing neon signs. Each passing car, each hurried footstep, was a reminder of his isolation. The once comforting hum of the city now felt like a mocking chorus, celebrating his downfall. He found himself drawn to the park, a place he'd once avoided, its quiet a stark contrast to the opulent noise of his penthouse. He sank onto a cold bench, the damp wood seeping into his clothes. The distant sounds of laughter, the rustling of leaves, seemed impossibly distant, almost unreal. He pulled the worn photograph from his pocket, his fingers tracing the smiling faces of his children. A tear escaped, a single hot drop against the cold surface. A shadow fell across him. He looked up, startled, to see a gaunt figure, a woman shrouded in darkness. It was Mrs. Dubois, the elderly woman who'd lived across the hall in his building. "Mr. Beaumont," she whispered, her voice frail, "I saw you leave the penthouse." He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "You look lost," she said, her voice laced with compassion. "They say pride comes before a fall, but sometimes," she paused, searching for the right words, "sometimes, falling allows you to see things more clearly." He stared at her, surprised by her words, by the unexpected kindness. He'd always seen her as just another resident, a face amongst many in his opulent world. Now her empathy felt like a lifeline. "I lost everything," he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. "Not everything," she countered gently. "You still have your memories, your strength, and a chance to start again. Don't lose sight of that." She offered him a small, knowing smile before turning and walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. Her words lingered, a fragile seed of hope taking root in the barren landscape of his despair. The city lights still flickered, but now they seemed less mocking, more indifferent, offering neither judgment nor celebration. Just the cold, hard reality of a new beginning. The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the turmoil raging within Arthur. He sat, rigid and pale, the cheap wooden chair digging into his spine. The lawyer's hushed pronouncements, asset seizures, bankruptcy filings were a blur, each word a hammer blow against his already shattered self. He felt the cold press of the handcuffs against his wrists, a tangible symbol of his ruin. Outside, the city roared, oblivious to his plight. Isabella watched from the gallery, her usual composure fractured. A flicker of something akin to regret, or was it guilt, crossed her face. Her victory felt hollow, the taste of ashes in her mouth. The carefully constructed facade of revenge had crumbled, revealing the emptiness beneath. Later, in the stark visiting room, separated by a thick pane of glass, their eyes met. The animosity was still there, sharp and undeniable, yet something else had shifted. Arthur saw a weariness in Isabella's eyes, a haunted look that mirrored his own. "It wasn't about the money," Arthur rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm between them. Isabella's gaze dropped. "You destroyed my family, Arthur. This was justice." Her voice was barely a whisper, laced with a pain that surprised him. "Justice? You ruined my life too." The words were a desperate plea, a cry for understanding. He saw a ghost of her former self, the woman he'd loved, lost beneath layers of bitterness and rage. "And I'm paying for it," Isabella admitted, her voice cracking. The cold calculation that had defined her was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that chilled Arthur to the bone. The revenge had consumed her, leaving her empty and alone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of their shared destruction. The city outside continued its relentless rhythm, a constant reminder of their shattered lives. But in that silent exchange, a fragile seed of something new took root, a glimmer of shared understanding in the ruins of their past. The bitter taste of revenge had left both of them starving. The stale air of the holding cell hung heavy, thick with the scent of disinfectant and despair. Arthur stared at the peeling paint on the wall, the chipped surface mirroring the fragments of his shattered life. The fluorescent hum was a relentless drone, a soundtrack to his ruin. He hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach a pale reflection of the void in his soul. His expensive suit, once a symbol of power, now felt like a suffocating shroud. A guard's gruff voice sliced through his numb haze. "Visit." Isabella stood on the other side of the thick glass partition, the harsh light accentuating the shadows under her eyes. The sharp angles of her face, once so alluring, were softened by a weariness that mirrored his own. Gone was the icy composure, replaced by a fragility that both horrified and strangely touched him. He spoke, his voice a raspy whisper, barely audible above the hum of the fluorescent lights. "It wasn't worth it, was it, Isabella?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze fixed on a point beyond him. Then slowly she spoke. "Revenge, it promised satisfaction, promised an end to the pain, but it only created more." Her voice, once crisp and controlled, was now cracked and brittle, like a delicate porcelain vase on the verge of shattering. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail through the meticulously applied makeup. "My family, I thought destroying you would somehow bring them back," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it didn't. It just left me empty." The words hung in the air, heavy with regret. He saw a flicker of the woman she once was, vulnerable, passionate, buried beneath the layers of vengeance. The image brought a fresh wave of pain, a cruel reminder of what he'd lost, of what he'd thrown away. "We both destroyed each other," he rasped, his voice thick with unshed tears. The glass between them felt like a physical barrier, separating them by an unbridgeable chasm. Yet, in the shared desolation, a flicker of understanding ignited. The bitter taste of revenge, he realized, left both of them starving. The stale air of the holding cell clung to Arthur like a shroud. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed, a relentless counterpoint to the gnawing emptiness in his gut. He watched Isabella through the thick glass, her usually flawless makeup smeared, revealing the raw fatigue etched beneath. The sharp angles of her face were softened, replaced by a haunting fragility. He saw a flicker of the woman he'd once loved, buried under layers of ice and vengeance. "They're seizing everything," Arthur rasped, his voice a dry whisper, barely audible. The words felt like grit in his throat. His penthouse, his empire, his life, all dissolving into the cold, unforgiving reality of his actions. Isabella's gaze drifted to the chipped paint on the wall, mirroring the fragments of her own shattered ambitions. "The money, it was never the point," she murmured, her voice a low tremor. The controlled fury he'd come to expect was gone, replaced by a weariness that mirrored his own. He saw it then, the faintest crack in her carefully constructed facade of icy revenge. A vulnerability, a raw, unfiltered grief that resonated with the despair clawing at his own heart. He saw her pain. It was about retribution, she continued, her voice catching, for what you did to my family, to my father. The tears that streamed down her face were not tears of triumph, but of profound regret. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the relentless hum of the fluorescent lights. Arthur felt a sudden, unexpected surge of pity for her. Not pity born of weakness, but a shared understanding of the corrosive nature of revenge, the emptiness it left behind. He had sought escape in Isabella. She'd sought it in destroying him. He remembered the lavish parties, the champagne flutes, the sycophantic smiles, the hollow laughter echoing in his opulent penthouse. The ghosts of those moments now felt like mocking specters. I never wanted to hurt you, he managed, the words thick with regret. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. He had hurt her profoundly, even if unconsciously at first. His betrayal had been the catalyst. Isabella looked up, her eyes locking with his across the glass. The hatred, the icy calculation, was fading, replaced by a look of bleak acceptance, of exhaustion. We both lost everything, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. But you lost something more important than wealth. The statement hung in the air, a heavy truth both recognized, the sting of it sharp and immediate. He had lost his family, his integrity, his very self. And in that devastating realization, a glimmer of something else sparked, a glimmer of hope in the desolate landscape of his ruin. The metallic tang of blood filled Arthur's nostrils, a stark contrast to the scent of expensive cologne that had once clung to him. He sat slumped against the cold, unforgiving steel of the holding cell wall, the cheap fabric of his jumpsuit scratching his skin. The fluorescent lights, buzzing like angry wasps, reflected harshly off the tear-streaked face of Isabella, visible through the thick glass partition. He hadn't eaten in days. A gnawing emptiness echoed the hollowness in his soul. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a distant, gaudy dream. The memory of Isabella's laughter, once music to his ears, was now a cruel mockery. Her meticulously planned revenge had stripped him bare, leaving behind only the raw, exposed nerves of his guilt. "They're taking the yacht," she whispered, her voice raspy, devoid of the usual icy control. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of lost dreams. He saw a tremor run through her, a vulnerability that shattered the carefully constructed image of the vengeful daughter. The sound of a guard's heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, a jarring interruption to the silent war waged between them. Arthur watched as Isabella's shoulders slumped, the faintest sigh escaping her lips. The strength she'd projected, the steely resolve that had driven her plan, seemed to crumble before his eyes. He saw not just the vengeful daughter, but a woman burdened by the weight of her actions, by the emptiness of her victory. "I wanted to hurt you," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible, a confession breaking through the hardened exterior. The words hung in the silence, raw and unfiltered. "But it doesn't feel like a victory," she added, her gaze fixed on some distant point. Arthur felt a strange mix of pity and self-loathing. He'd been so blinded by his own ambition, so consumed by his selfish desires, that he'd missed the warning signs, the subtle hints of Isabella's carefully planned retribution. The gilded cage he'd built for himself had imprisoned him, and now the bars were closing in on her as well. It's all gone," Arthur whispered, his voice choked with grief. The words were a lament, a recognition of his own utter ruin, but also a shared understanding of their mutual destruction. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, suffocating him. Isabella nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. The relentless hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the silence, a testament to the devastating consequences of their actions, to the wreckage of their intertwined lives. The game was over. They were both left standing amidst the ruins. The stale air of the holding cell hung heavy, thick with the scent of disinfectant and despair. Arthur shivered, not from the chill of the concrete floor, but from the icy grip of regret. Isabella, separated only by the thick glass, mirrored his desolation. Her meticulously crafted revenge, the culmination of years of planning, had left her hollow. The expensive silk dresses, the penthouse overlooking the city, all were gone, replaced by the harsh reality of their mutual destruction. He watched her trace patterns on the condensation clinging to the glass, her fingers leaving smudged trails. The strength he'd once found so alluring now seemed brittle, fragile. "It wasn't enough," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The words hung in the air, a poignant counterpoint to the relentless buzz of the fluorescent lights. Arthur saw a flicker of something akin to fear in her eyes, a stark contrast to the icy calculation he'd witnessed before. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Her revenge hadn't brought her satisfaction, only a profound emptiness. He wanted to reach out, to cross the chasm separating them, but the glass remained an insurmountable barrier. "It's never enough, is it?" he murmured, his voice raw with the weight of his own failures. The words were as much a confession as a statement. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant clang of a metal door and the rhythmic thump of his own heart. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, the abandoned family, the shattered business, the life he'd carelessly thrown away. He saw his children's faces, their hurt eyes accusing him silently. The guilt was a physical entity, crushing him beneath its weight. Isabella's gaze drifted to the floor, her shoulders slumping. He saw a tear escape, tracing a lonely path down her cheek. The carefully constructed facade, the mask of icy vengeance, finally cracked. The vulnerability was unexpected, startling in its rawness. The daughter of his rival, the architect of his downfall, was simply broken. He saw not a villain, but a woman deeply wounded, trapped by her own vengeful actions. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. Perhaps, in the wreckage of their shared destruction, a glimmer of hope remained. Perhaps, even in this desolate landscape of ruin and despair, a path toward redemption, however long and arduous, might yet be found. The game was over, but the story, he realized, was far from finished. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous dirge above Arthur, their harsh glare reflecting off the sterile white walls of the holding cell. He tasted the metallic tang of blood, a faint trickle from a split lip courtesy of a particularly zealous bailiff. The air, thick with the smell of disinfectant and despair, clung to him like a shroud. Across the room, Isabella sat hunched, her expensive silk dress, a relic of a life now shattered, crumpled around her. The vibrant city lights, once her stage, were now a mocking reminder of her fallen empire. "They're going to charge you with embezzlement," Arthur said, his voice hoarse, a mere whisper against the relentless hum of the lights. He didn't need to look at her to know she was listening. Her stillness was more intense than any outburst. Isabella didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the grimy floor. The silence stretched, a vast and desolate space mirroring the emptiness gnawing at them both. The meticulously crafted revenge, the years of planning, had yielded nothing but ashes. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow, meandering path down her cheek. The carefully constructed facade, the mask of icy vengeance, cracked, revealing a woman fractured, lost. Arthur watched, a strange mix of pity and understanding stirring within him. He thought of his children, their faces, blurry with unshed tears and unspoken accusations. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing burden he'd carried for years. It was a weight shared now, a silent communion between two broken souls. "It wasn't personal," Isabella finally rasped, her voice brittle. The words hung in the air, inadequate, almost pathetic. Arthur chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Personal? You destroyed my life, Isabella. You destroyed my family." She didn't deny it, couldn't. The truth hung heavy, a tangible thing between them. The years of resentment, fueled by his own cruelty, had twisted her into something monstrous. Now, in the wreckage of their mutual destruction, she saw the monster she'd become. "I wanted to hurt you, more than you hurt my father," she confessed, her voice barely audible. A heartbreaking confession whispered into the suffocating silence. Arthur leaned back, his head resting against the cold, unforgiving wall. "And you did," he said quietly. The statement wasn't an accusation, but an acknowledgement. A stark, brutal truth. The game of revenge had ended in a draw, both players left bleeding and broken on the field of battle. The destruction was complete, but perhaps, just perhaps, out of the wreckage, a path towards something else might be found. The stale air of the holding cell pressed against Arthur's lungs, a physical manifestation of his despair. He watched Isabella, her face etched with a weariness that belied her previous icy composure. The fluorescent lights buzzed, a relentless soundtrack to their shared ruin. He thought of his children, their faces a blur of hurt and disappointment. The guilt was a constant ache, a heavy stone in his gut. He shifted, the rough concrete digging into his bruised ribs. I need to see them," he mumbled, the words catching in his throat. The image of his youngest daughter's tear-stained face haunted him. Isabella looked up, her eyes, usually blazing with anger, now filled with a desolate emptiness. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. The expensive silk of her dress, a symbol of her past life, lay crumpled around her, a discarded trophy. "They won't want to see you," she whispered, her voice raspy, barely audible above the hum of the lights. The bitterness in her tone was laced with a surprising undercurrent of pain. She was a woman broken just as he was. The victory she'd craved had turned to ashes in her mouth. Arthur closed his eyes, picturing his wife, Sarah's face. He'd hurt her so deeply, and now, faced with the consequences of his actions, the weight of his betrayal was unbearable. "I have to try," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "I have to make amends." A sliver of hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, fluttered in the desolate space between them. The game of revenge was over, but a new, more arduous game had begun, the game of redemption. The path was uncertain, strewn with obstacles and fraught with pain, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a glimmer of something other than despair. The journey toward reconciliation wouldn't be easy, but it was a journey he was willing to undertake, for the sake of his family, and perhaps for himself. The seeds of forgiveness, tiny and tentative, had been sown. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of the visiting room. Arthur sat across from Sarah, the woman he'd so carelessly discarded, her face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own. Years of carefully constructed defenses crumbled before the raw honesty in her eyes. He saw the ghost of the woman he'd loved, buried under layers of hurt and disillusionment. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Words seemed inadequate, hollow shells against the weight of his actions. He reached for a tissue, his hands trembling, wiping a stray tear from Sarah's cheek. The touch was tentative, hesitant, filled with a profound awareness of the damage he'd inflicted. I know I can't undo what I've done," he began, his voice a low murmur, "but I want to try, to make things right. I know it's a long shot." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, twisting a silver ring around her finger, a ring he'd given her, a symbol of a love long extinguished. The silence stretched, a palpable thing, filled with unspoken pain and unspoken hopes. Finally, she looked up, her eyes clouded with a mixture of sorrow and anger. "Right?" she repeated, the word laced with bitter irony. "After everything? After you threw away our lives for her?" The sting of her words cut deep. He deserved her anger, he knew it. He'd earned her contempt. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "I was a fool," he said, his voice thick with remorse. Blind. Selfish. He watched her, his heart pounding, praying for a sign of forgiveness, a flicker of understanding. The years of absence, the pain he'd inflicted, hung between them like a suffocating shroud. Yet, in the depths of her sorrow, he saw a glimmer of something else, a faint spark of hope, flickering in the ashes of their broken relationship. The journey would be long, arduous, and fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a genuine flicker of hope. The road to redemption was a long one, but he was finally ready to walk it. The muted tones of the hospital waiting room felt strangely comforting after the sterile harshness of the penthouse. Arthur clutched a lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste mirroring the turmoil in his gut. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, the jagged edges of his ruined life clawing at his sleep. He glanced at his watch, the luminous hands mocking his wasted time. He was early, deliberately so. He needed time to steel himself, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with his daughter, Chloe. Chloe arrived, her arrival a silent storm. The crisp lines of her tailored suit couldn't disguise the tremor in her hands as she sat rigidly opposite him. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. He opened his mouth, the words catching in his throat. The years of neglect, of absence, loomed between them like a chasm. I wanted to apologize, he began, his voice barely a whisper above the low hum of the fluorescent lights. For everything. Chloe's gaze was cold, unwavering. Everything? She repeated, her voice sharp, edged with icy contempt. You think an apology can fix this? Fix the years you spent ignoring us? Ignoring me? He flinched. He deserved her anger, her disdain. He'd earned it through a lifetime of selfish choices. He saw the reflection of his own fractured self in her eyes, the hurt, the betrayal, the simmering rage. He knew he couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the pain he'd inflicted, but he could try to atone. He could try to rebuild. No, he admitted, his voice cracking. An apology isn't enough, but it's a start. He reached across the small table, his hand trembling slightly. I know I can't make up for lost time, but, his voice faltered, I want to try to be a father to you, to be a part of your life, however you'll allow me to be. The silence that followed felt heavy, suffocating. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest, hoping, praying, for some sign of forgiveness, a flicker of understanding. Anything. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a clock on the wall. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a stark contrast to the opulent fragrances that once filled Arthur's penthouse. Chloe's silence was a wall, impenetrable and chilling. He watched her, her perfectly sculpted face betraying nothing but a carefully maintained composure that masked the storm raging beneath. The coffee, long cold, felt like lead in his stomach. He shifted in his chair, the uncomfortable plastic digging into his thighs. I understand if you can't forgive me, he finally said, his voice raspy from disuse and emotion. I don't expect you to, but I need you to know, I'm not asking for forgiveness yet, just understanding. Chloe's lips tightened. A faint tremor ran through her perfectly manicured hand as she reached for her own untouched coffee, the steam rising like a fragile veil. The slight movement revealed the delicate silver bracelet on her wrist, a family heirloom he'd carelessly pawned years ago. The memory lanced through him, sharp and agonizing. Understanding? She repeated, the word laced with bitterness. What is there to understand? You chose your mistress over your family, over me. You ripped our lives apart for a fleeting moment of what? Ego? Self-gratification. Her voice, though controlled, was charged with a raw pain that resonated deeply within him. He saw the ghost of the little girl he'd neglected, the bright, trusting eyes now replaced by a hardened gaze that reflected years of disappointment and hurt. The chasm between them felt vast and unbridgeable. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, an unbearable burden. He hadn't just abandoned his family. He'd systematically destroyed them, brick by painful brick. He deserved her anger, her rejection. He deserved everything she could throw at him. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I know what I did, and I can't undo it, but I can try to be better, to be the father you deserve, even if it's too late." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for some sign of hope, some crack in the wall of her anger. The silence hung heavy once more, a tense battleground between remorse and unforgiveness. The future, uncertain, stretched before them, clouded by the lingering shadows of the past. The sterile scent of the hospital waiting room clung to Arthur like a shroud. He sat rigidly, the plastic chair unforgiving. Across from him, Chloe stared at her hands, her knuckles white as she clenched them. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. He watched a tear trace a path through the carefully applied makeup on her cheek, a silent testament to the years of suppressed pain. The coffee, lukewarm and bitter, mirrored the taste in his mouth. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and strained. I know what I did, Chloe. There's no excuse, no justification." He didn't look at her, unable to bear the weight of her gaze. Instead, he focused on a chipped paint fleck on the wall, its imperfections a stark reminder of his own. Chloe finally looked up. Her eyes, the same shade of hazel as his daughter's, were filled with a sorrow that cut him to the core. "You took everything from me, Arthur. My childhood, my trust, my belief in a decent man." Her voice was low, a controlled tremor betraying the effort it took to maintain her composure. "You traded our family for a fleeting moment of indulgence. And now you sit here, expecting pity." He flinched at the word. Pity wasn't what he craved. It was understanding, a chance to atone, however small. "No, Chloe, I don't expect pity. I want to make amends, to rebuild what I destroyed." He met her gaze, his own eyes brimming with unshed tears. The years melted away, revealing the frightened boy who'd always sought his father's approval, only to have that boy buried under layers of ambition and self-deception. The air hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken accusations and a desperate yearning for forgiveness. He saw the flicker of something akin to hope in her eyes, a tiny spark in the vast darkness of her hurt. The silence stretched again, but this time, it felt less suffocating, more expectant. A fragile bridge was being built, brick by painful brick, from the ruins of a shattered family. The battle for redemption had begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic battled with the faint aroma of lilies from a wilting bouquet. Chloe's silence felt heavier than the weight of Arthur's guilt. He watched her, a fragile woman etched with the harsh lines of betrayal and loss, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. Sunlight, muted by the hospital window's grime, cast long shadows across the room. "It wasn't just the money, Arthur," Chloe finally said, her voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, each syllable laden with years of unspoken pain. "It was the principle. You didn't just leave us. You deliberately destroyed us." Arthur winced, the coffee's bitterness mirroring the taste of his regret. He reached for her hand, a hesitant gesture that spoke volumes of his desperate need for forgiveness. She didn't pull away, but her fingers remained stiff, unyielding. I know," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I understand your anger. You're hurt. I deserve it all." He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his remorse. "But I want a chance to show you," he trailed off, searching for the right words, finding none that could adequately express the depth of his contrition. The silence stretched, a tangible entity hanging between them, charged with unspoken accusations and a fragile hope. The chipped paint fleck on the wall seemed to mock him, a permanent scar mirroring the irreparable damage he'd inflicted. Chloe's eyes, usually bright and vibrant, were dull with exhaustion and sorrow. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. She blinked, and then, unexpectedly, A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "A chance?" she repeated, her voice laced with both weariness and a hint of something else, curiosity. "How do you propose to show me, Arthur? After everything?" The question hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation wrapped in one. Arthur looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not just the wronged wife, but the woman he'd once loved, the woman he'd so carelessly discarded. The battle for redemption had begun, a long and arduous journey paved with doubt, remorse, and the uncertain promise of forgiveness. The future remained shrouded in uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, a sliver of hope pierced the darkness. The sterile hospital room felt colder than the November rain lashing against the window panes. Chloe's silence hung heavy, a tangible weight in the suffocating air. Arthur shifted in the uncomfortable plastic chair, the cheap material clinging to his expensive suit. He watched her, his ex-wife, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond simple exhaustion. It was the weariness of a spirit broken, repeatedly battered by the relentless waves of his betrayal. The lilies, a pathetic offering, drooped in their vase. Their scent, once sweet, now felt cloying, almost mocking. "It's not just about the money, Arthur," Chloe finally said, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic drip of an four machine. Her words, though soft, carried the sharp sting of 1,000 unspoken accusations. It was everything, the children, their memories, their trust. "You stole it all." A tear escaped, tracing a slow, glistening path down her cheek. He wanted to reach for her, to wipe it away, but his hand hesitated, paralyzed by the fear of rejection. The silence stretched, a painful chasm between them, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the relentless drumming of rain. He saw then, with a clarity that cut through the fog of his guilt, that this wasn't just about regaining her forgiveness. It was about facing the depth of his actions, the irreversible damage he'd caused. He had to understand her pain, not just intellectually, but viscerally. He had to feel the sting of her loss, the cold emptiness of betrayal that had become her constant companion. "I know," he finally managed, his voice a rasp. "I understand. I deserve your anger, your hurt, everything." His gaze dropped to his hands, gnarled and trembling. He felt the weight of his past, the crushing burden of his selfishness. He'd not only destroyed his family, he'd destroyed himself in the process. Chloe's gaze softened, ever so slightly. A flicker of something akin to understanding crossed her face. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the wall of her anger, a tiny opening for the possibility of healing. "Then show me," she whispered, her voice laced with a fragile hope that mirrored his own. "Show me that this isn't just another performance, Arthur. Show me you've changed." The challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown. Arthur nodded, his heart heavy but filled with a newfound resolve. The battle for redemption had begun, and he was finally ready to fight. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a stark contrast to the opulent perfume Isabella had favored. Arthur sat across from his daughter, Emily, in the sparsely furnished waiting room. Sunlight, muted by the grimy window panes, cast long shadows across the worn plastic chairs. Emily, barely 17, sat rigidly, her hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the occasional muffled cough from the hallway. I didn't know," Arthur began, his voice a fragile whisper lost in the cavernous space. The words felt inadequate, a pathetic attempt to bridge the chasm of his betrayal. Emily didn't meet his gaze. "Didn't know what, Dad? Didn't know you were a monster." Her voice was sharp, brittle, laced with a pain that cut him to the core. He saw the years of hurt reflected in her eyes, a hurt he'd inflicted with his callous disregard. He traded their laughter, their shared breakfasts, their family vacations, for a gilded cage built on lies. He wanted to reach for her, to offer some kind of solace, but fear held him back. The memory of her face, etched with confusion and betrayal on the day he left, flooded back. the same confusion he now saw reflected in her eyes. I was lost, he stammered, the words barely audible. I made terrible mistakes. I failed you all. A single tear escaped Emily's eye, tracing a path down her cheek. It was a silent accusation, more devastating than any shouted reproach. He knew he deserved the pain he saw in her eyes. He deserved everything. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him, reminding him of the years of happiness he'd thrown away. He'd need more than words to repair the damage. He needed to earn their forgiveness through actions, not empty promises. Lost. Emily finally spoke, her voice laced with bitter sarcasm. You were lost in a sea of money and self-importance. Her gaze hardened. You know, I always thought you were different, Dad. I thought you were better. The pain in her words was a physical blow, leaving him breathless and reeling. He had been better once. He'd been a loving husband, a devoted father. He'd let that man die, buried beneath a mountain of his own ambition. The only thing left was regret. He needed to show them, not just tell them, he would change. He needed to show his children, his wife, that the man who left them for a mistress was not the man he was now. The road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. But the seed of redemption had been planted, and he was finally ready to cultivate it. The sterile white walls of the penthouse felt colder than ever. Isabella paced, the polished marble floor echoing her restless steps. The champagne, once a symbol of her victory, sat untouched, its bubbles now mirroring the turmoil within her. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. Revenge, she'd thought, would be sweet, a delicious antidote to years of humiliation, of watching her family crumble under Arthur's relentless ambition. But the victory felt hollow, a bitter taste clinging to the back of her throat. The penthouse, once a trophy, now felt like a gilded cage of her own making. The city lights, usually a captivating spectacle, only amplified her solitude. She traced the rim of a crystal glass, its icy chill a stark contrast to the burning shame that consumed her. A knock echoed through the cavernous space, breaking the oppressive silence. Her lawyer, a stern, impeccably dressed woman, entered, her expression grave. The charges are filed, Isabella, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. Fraud, embezzlement. The list is extensive. Isabella flinched, the weight of her actions crashing down upon her. The meticulously planned revenge had backfired, ensnaring her in its own web of deceit. I didn't expect this, Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic hum of the city. The lawyer's response was a clipped, professional silence. The emptiness of the penthouse suddenly felt vast, mirroring the hollowness within her. Years of carefully crafted plans, of meticulous scheming, had led her to this desolate point. The thrill of the game, the intoxicating power of manipulating Arthur, had blinded her to the profound emptiness at its core. She had sought to inflict pain, but in doing so, she had only inflicted pain upon herself. The cold, hard reality of her situation settled upon her, leaving her with nothing but the bitter taste of regret and the crushing weight of her actions. The city lights outside seemed to mock her, indifferent to her fall from grace. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of triumph, now represented the crushing weight of her self-inflicted destruction. The champagne remained untouched, a silent testament to a victory that had turned to ash in her hands. The stale air in the visiting room hung heavy with unspoken words. Arthur sat across from his daughter, Clara, the years etching lines of worry onto her face, mirroring the grief etched onto his own. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a distant memory, a life lived in a fog of self-deception. The muted gray of the room seemed to absorb the light, leaving a dull ache in his chest. Clara's voice, though quiet, carried the weight of years of hurt. "You just left," she said, her gaze fixed on her clasped hands. The scent of her perfume, a familiar floral blend, brought a wave of painful nostalgia, a phantom touch of the life he'd carelessly discarded. He wanted to reach across the table, to touch her hand, but fear held him back. Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his regret. "I know," he whispered, his voice raspy. "There's no excuse. I was blind." He watched the way her shoulders slumped, the subtle tremble in her hands, and the painful truth of his words settled in. The polished wooden table felt cold beneath his fingertips. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. He continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I see now. I understand the pain I caused. I need to make amends." The words felt inadequate, clumsy attempts to bridge a chasm years in the making. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not forgiveness. Not yet, but perhaps. A crack in the wall of resentment she'd built. A tentative smile played on Clara's lips, hesitant, fragile. "It's a start," she replied, her voice softening ever so slightly. The sound was a fragile melody, a hopeful note in the symphony of his remorse. The air in the room, though still heavy, felt marginally lighter, as if a single sunbeam had pierced the gloom. The weight of his past actions remained, a burden he would carry, but in this small, hesitant connection, he glimpsed the faintest glimmer of redemption. The journey would be long, arduous, and filled with obstacles, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a fragile seed of hope taking root within his weary heart. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air in the small, sparsely furnished room. Isabella sat rigid, her perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly in her lap, the silence amplifying the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed to accentuate the sharp angles of her face, the carefully constructed mask of composure threatening to crack. Outside, the city roared, a relentless symphony of indifference. Inside, only the ticking clock and the weight of her actions held sway. A soft knock echoed, then a guard slid open the heavy steel door, revealing a gaunt, drawn Arthur. He looked older, his expensive suit replaced with worn clothes, the vibrant gleam in his eyes dulled. He moved with a hesitant stiffness, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his ruin. He took a seat opposite her, his gaze avoiding hers, focusing instead on the chipped paint of the wall. I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice a rough whisper, the words catching in his throat. The apology hung in the air, fragile and hesitant, a stark contrast to the opulent pronouncements he'd once uttered with such effortless confidence. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Isabella remained silent, her eyes fixed on her hands. The carefully crafted facade, built on years of meticulous planning and cold calculation, was crumbling. The weight of her revenge, once a source of bitter satisfaction, now felt like a lead weight dragging her down. He continued, his voice barely above a breath. "I know saying sorry doesn't fix things. It won't bring back what you lost. But," he paused, his gaze finally meeting hers. In his eyes, she saw not the arrogant businessman she'd manipulated, but a broken man grappling with the consequences of his actions. A man who, perhaps, understood the depth of her pain. A single tear escaped Isabella's eye, tracing a path through the meticulously applied makeup. It was a tear not of triumph, but of profound loneliness. The emptiness of her victory echoed in the vast expanse of the room, a stark reminder of the human cost of her revenge. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a tremor. "It's not about fixing things anymore, Arthur," she whispered, her gaze distant, lost in the swirling memories of her past. "It's about living with them." The clock ticked on, marking the passage of time, a relentless witness to their shared burden. The weight of their past hung heavy, but in the silence, a tentative seed of understanding, of perhaps even forgiveness, began to take root. The stale air of the prison visiting room hung heavy with unspoken words. A single, bare bulb cast harsh shadows across the worn metal table where Isabella sat, her usually impeccable appearance now marred by a pallor that spoke of sleepless nights and inner turmoil. The fluorescent hum vibrated in the quiet, a constant, irritating thrum against the silence. Arthur, his face etched with the lines of regret and hardship, sat opposite her. He'd lost the weight. The sharp edges of his once imposing figure softened, replaced by a gauntness that mirrored the hollowness in his soul. He reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly as he pushed a worn photograph towards her. It showed a younger Isabella, vibrant and full of life, laughing with her family before his actions had shattered their world. I found this," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I'm so sorry." Isabella stared at the picture, her fingers tracing the outline of her younger self. The image seemed to burn through the layers of bitterness she'd painstakingly constructed, revealing the raw wound beneath. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. It was a tear not of anger, but of a grief long suppressed. "Sorry doesn't bring them back, Arthur," she said, her voice barely a murmur, thick with unshed tears. "It doesn't erase what you did." Her eyes, though still filled with sorrow, held a flicker of something else, a nascent understanding. The carefully cultivated anger, the icy resolve that had sustained her through her plan, was beginning to crack. The bitter taste of victory had long since turned to ash in her mouth. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the photograph. "I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends, even if it's only to myself." His voice cracked with emotion, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The silence between them was not empty, but thick with the unspoken acknowledgement of shared pain, a shared understanding of the irreversible damage they had inflicted on each other and those around them. The ticking of a distant clock seemed to amplify the stillness, a constant reminder of time's relentless march. The room, cold and sterile, became a crucible where remorse and forgiveness began their slow, agonizing dance. The possibility of redemption, however distant and uncertain, had begun to emerge from the ruins of their shattered lives. The following weeks were a blur of muted apologies and hesitant gestures. Arthur, humbled and gaunt, found himself volunteering at a soup kitchen, the clatter of pans a strangely soothing counterpoint to the silence that had haunted his penthouse. The scent of simmering vegetables, sharp and earthy, replaced the cloying aroma of expensive perfume. He traded tailored suits for worn jeans, the feel of rough fabric a stark contrast to the silk he'd once considered essential. One afternoon, while sorting donations, he saw her. Isabella, her face etched with weariness, was helping distribute food, her movements devoid of the practiced grace he remembered. The sharp angles of her jaw were softened, replaced by a fragility that hinted at the toll her revenge had taken. She didn't look at him, but he saw the tremor in her hands as she handed a woman a loaf of bread. He approached cautiously. The air crackled with unspoken words, a potent mix of regret and apprehension. "Isabella," he began, his voice a low rumble. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the line of people waiting patiently. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the low hum of conversation and the rhythmic thud of footsteps. I wanted to say," he started again, his voice catching in his throat. The smell of stale bread and simmering onions filled his nostrils, a sharp reminder of his new reality. "I know saying sorry doesn't change anything, but..." Finally, she turned, her eyes meeting his. They were no longer cold and calculating, but filled with a profound sadness. "It doesn't," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the low murmur of the kitchen. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, unnoticed by the other volunteers. "But," she added, a flicker of something resembling hope in her eyes, Maybe it's a start." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the long, arduous road to redemption that lay ahead for them both. The rhythmic clatter of pots and pans suddenly sounded hopeful, a promise of a future built not on revenge, but on the fragile foundation of forgiveness. The soup kitchen, a haven of muted chaos, became their unlikely meeting place. The scent of simmering lentils and the low hum of conversation were a constant backdrop to their hesitant interactions. Weeks bled into months. Arthur, his tailored suits replaced by worn denim, found a strange solace in the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the repetitive task a meditative counterpoint to the turmoil within. He saw Isabella almost daily, her sharp edges softened, her movements less precise, less controlled. The coldness in her eyes had receded, replaced by a weary acceptance. One blustery afternoon, finding himself alone with her amidst stacks of donated canned goods, Arthur cleared his throat. The tinny clang of a falling can echoed in the sudden silence. "Isabella," he began, his voice raspy from disuse. She didn't turn, her gaze fixed on a dented can of peaches. The wind howled outside, mirroring the storm raging within him. "I know what I did. Destroyed your family." His voice cracked, the weight of his confession heavy in the air. Slowly, she turned, her eyes, once glittering with icy resolve, now clouded with a profound sadness. "And mine," she whispered, the words barely audible above the wind's mournful cry. "I destroyed myself." She traced a finger along the rim of the dented can, a small, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand. He watched her, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt and empathy. The sterile scent of disinfectant couldn't mask the raw vulnerability emanating from her. "I understand the pain you felt," he said, his voice thick with remorse. "But revenge, it only brings more pain." A single tear rolled down her cheek, catching the weak winter sunlight. "I know," she breathed, her voice raw with emotion. It was empty, a hollow victory. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time since their venomous game began. He saw a flicker of something resembling hope in her eyes, something beyond the ruins of her meticulously planned vengeance. A shared understanding passed between them, born not from affection, but from a mutual recognition of their shared wreckage, a shared burden of guilt, and perhaps a fragile seed of hope. The sound of the wind outside died down, replaced by a quiet understanding. Their journey had only just begun. The legal proceedings were swift, a stark contrast to the slow, agonizing unraveling of Arthur's life. Isabella, pale and gaunt, offered a quiet plea of guilty, her voice barely a whisper above the hushed murmur of the courtroom. There was no dramatic outburst, no theatrical display of remorse, only a weary acceptance etched onto her face. The fluorescent lights seemed to amplify the shadows under her eyes, highlighting the toll her vengeance had taken. Arthur watched from the gallery, the weight of his past crushing him anew. He saw not a villain in the defendant's box, but a broken woman, a victim of her own poisoned plan. He'd visited her once, after the sentencing, during a brief supervised visit at the correctional facility. The stark, sterile environment felt as cold and empty as her expression when he arrived. The metallic scent of disinfectant hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of her confinement. I'm sorry, Isabella," he began, his voice rough. The words felt clumsy, inadequate in the face of the devastation they both had wrought. She looked at him, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but no warmth. "For what?" she asked, her voice flat. "For everything," he said, the sincerity of his remorse unmistakable. "For my actions, for the pain I caused your family, and for not seeing the pain in you, too." He paused, searching for the right words. "I wish I could undo it all." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of the ventilation system. She finally spoke, her gaze drifting to the chipped paint on the wall. "Revenge is a hollow thing," she murmured, a hint of sadness in her voice. "It leaves you empty, Arthur, emptier than you can imagine." Then, something unexpected happened. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "But perhaps," she continued, her voice barely audible, "it also shows you what truly matters. A genuine regret," he thought, "not for the punishment, but for the wasted years." The visitation ended abruptly, but the seed of understanding had been planted. The sterile white room, the metallic smell, the cold silence, all faded into the background as the weight of mutual regret, and maybe even the faintest possibility of redemption, hung in the air between them. He left the prison feeling not only the weight of his own actions, but the burden of her pain, a shared grief that bound them together in a way he never would have imagined. The future remained uncertain, a blank canvas upon which they would each have to paint their own path towards atonement and, perhaps, a fragile, hard-earned peace. The crisp autumn air bit at Arthur's exposed skin as he walked towards his old family home. Leaves, the color of burnt umber and decaying gold, crunched under his worn shoes. He hadn't been here in a year since his life had imploded, a year since he'd traded the sterile perfection of his penthouse for the gnawing emptiness of a motel room. The house, once vibrant with laughter and the scent of freshly baked bread, now wore a cloak of silent sorrow. He could almost hear the echoes of his children's joyful cries, a stark contrast to the quiet desperation that clung to him like a second skin. He rang the doorbell, his hand trembling. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Sarah, his estranged wife, her face etched with a mixture of weariness and cautious curiosity. Her eyes, once sparkling with affection, now held a guarded distance. "Arthur," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "Sarah, I need to talk to you." The silence that followed hung heavy with unspoken accusations and years of regret. The aroma of coffee, a scent that once represented comfort and warmth, now felt sharp and alien in this space filled with unspoken hurt. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood momentarily grounding him, yet the underlying air of sadness was undeniable. He looked around, noting the faint traces of his children's presence. A worn teddy bear in the corner, a half-finished drawing on the table. They want to see you," Sarah finally said, her voice low and strained. She gestured towards the living room where two figures, barely discernible in the half-light, sat hunched on the sofa. His children. His heart ached with a fresh wave of guilt. He had failed them utterly and completely. He moved towards them, each step a painful reminder of his past mistakes. The weight of his actions bore down on him, suffocating him. His children, now adolescents, looked at him with a mixture of apprehension and anger. The encounter was fraught with pain, with unspoken resentments, with tears and shattered hopes. But amidst the storm of accusation and grief, a fragile seed of hope began to sprout. His children's words were laced with hurt, but also with a desperate yearning for the father they had lost. A father now desperately trying to reclaim a space in their lives. The air was thick with unshed tears and the bitter taste of regret. Yet, underneath it all, there was the faintest promise of reconciliation. The road ahead was long, arduous, and undeniably difficult. But in that living room, filled with the shadows of the past and the faint glimmer of a new dawn, Arthur began his climb out of the abyss he'd created. The scent of sawdust and varnish clung to the air in Arthur's small workshop, a far cry from the polished marble and mahogany of his former life. He meticulously sanded a piece of wood, the rhythmic rasp a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil still swirling within him. He'd found solace in the quiet simplicity of carpentry, his rough hands shaping raw material into something beautiful, a stark contrast to the fractured pieces of his life. The sun, slanting through the grimy window, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny reminder of the past he was leaving behind. One evening, Sarah came to visit, bringing with her a plate of freshly baked cookies, a small gesture, yet laden with unspoken meaning. They sat on mismatched chairs, the silence between them comfortable, yet charged with years of unspoken pain. "The kids, they're doing better," Sarah said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Arthur nodded, his gaze fixed on his calloused hands. "I know. I see it in their letters. They still have questions," Sarah continued, her voice wavering slightly. "About everything." Arthur looked up, meeting her eyes. The resentment, once so palpable, had softened, replaced by a weary understanding. "I understand," he said, his voice low, "and I'm here to answer them whenever they're ready." A small smile touched Sarah's lips. "There's a lot to forgive, Arthur." "I know," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." He paused, then added, "But I'm not asking for forgiveness yet. Just understanding. Sarah reached across the small table, her hand covering his. The simple act spoke volumes, a bridge built across the chasm of their broken past. The warmth of her touch sent a jolt through him, a flicker of the warmth he'd almost forgotten. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful sound that somehow felt less menacing now, less like the tempest in his soul, and more like the natural cycle of life, of destruction and rebirth. The air, once filled with the bitter sting of regret, now held a faint, fragile hope. A new chapter was beginning, one carved not in marble, but in the humble, enduring grain of wood. The courtroom was stifling, the air thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat. Isabella sat ramrod straight, her usual composure fractured. The judge's gavel, a sharp crack in the suffocating silence, echoed the finality of her sentence. 3 years. 3 years for orchestrating a downfall, for the calculated destruction of a man's life. Outside, the city roared, a relentless wave crashing against the shore of her solitude. The victory, so intoxicatingly sweet a year ago, now tasted like ash. She'd envisioned this moment countless times. Arthur's ruin, a triumphant symphony played out in her mind. But the reality was different, emptier. The satisfaction was a hollow shell, leaving behind only a profound emptiness. The penthouse, once a symbol of her revenge, now felt like a mausoleum. The prison visiting room was stark, a brutal contrast to the luxury she'd known. Arthur sat across from her, his face etched with lines of hardship, yet a strange calm radiated from him. He'd aged, but there was a strength in his eyes, a quiet dignity she hadn't seen before. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice a low rumble. The words were simple, but they held the weight of a lifetime. Isabella looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. His remorse wasn't a performance, but a raw, aching honesty. He hadn't come to gloat, to revel in her downfall. He simply wanted to understand. "It wasn't about hurting you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The truth, long buried under layers of anger and betrayal, finally surfaced. It had been about the gaping wound her father's ruin had left, a wound she tried to cauterize with revenge, only to scar herself deeper. The silence stretched, broken only by the muffled sounds from beyond the glass. His eyes, though lined with sorrow, held no judgment, only a weary understanding, a profound empathy that mirrored the growing understanding within her own heart. The city outside raged, but inside the sterile room, a fragile peace began to take root, a seed of forgiveness, planted in the desolate landscape of her soul. The long road to redemption lay ahead, but for the first time, Isabella saw a glimmer of light at its end. The scent of freshly baked bread, a stark contrast to the sterile air of the prison visiting room, hung faintly in the air. Sunlight, filtered through the grimy window, illuminated dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Arthur, looking thinner, but somehow more at peace, watched Isabella sketch in a small notebook. Her hand, once so sure and elegant, now trembled slightly. The lines she drew were hesitant, unsure, a far cry from the precise strokes of her earlier work. "It's different," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Not looking up, Arthur smiled, a gentle curve of his lips. "It is, isn't it?" He watched her, a quiet empathy filling the space between them. The bitterness, the consuming anger, seemed to have leached away, leaving behind a fragile vulnerability. The weight of her actions, the crushing weight of her revenge, seemed to have finally broken her down. I thought it would be different," she confessed, her voice catching. "I thought I'd feel something." "Satisfaction?" Arthur offered softly, his gaze meeting hers. He saw the flicker of self-loathing in her eyes, the ghost of the woman she'd once been. She nodded, a single, almost imperceptible movement. "But it's empty, hollow, like a beautiful shell with nothing inside." A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening streak on the pale skin. Arthur reached across the small table, his hand hovering over hers before gently settling on top. The contact was brief yet profound, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their past. "Revenge is a poor substitute for healing," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "It only leaves you emptier than before." Isabella looked at him, truly seeing him now. Not the arrogant businessman, nor the broken man she'd left bankrupt and alone, but a man who had found peace, a man who had chosen forgiveness over bitterness. It was a strength, a resilience that touched something deep within her. The city outside continued its relentless symphony, but the small room held a stillness, a quiet acceptance of what had been. The road to redemption wasn't easy, but for the first time, Isabella felt she wasn't walking it alone. A fragile hope, a tiny seed of possibility, bloomed in the desolate landscape of her heart. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth clung to Arthur's worn jacket as he knelt, tending his small vegetable patch. Sunlight warmed his face, a stark contrast to the icy chill that had once permeated his penthouse. His hands, once accustomed to signing million-dollar deals, were now rough and calloused, but they moved with a gentle purpose, coaxing life from the soil. He hummed a forgotten tune, a melody from his childhood, a life seemingly a million miles away from the opulent prison of his past. The small cottage, nestled in a quiet valley, was a world apart from the glittering city skyline. He straightened, his back protesting mildly, and glanced at the small, hand-hewn wooden birdhouse perched on a post. His youngest daughter, Lily, had helped him build it. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile he hadn't felt in years. The silence was broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant murmur of a stream. It was a peace he'd craved, a peace hard-earned through self-reflection and painful reconciliation. A letter arrived, the crisp white envelope a jarring interruption to the tranquil scene. He hesitated, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. It was from Isabella's lawyer. He opened it slowly, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs. The legal proceedings were nearing their end. The details were stark, but the tone was surprisingly understanding. She had accepted responsibility for her actions. There was no bitterness, no veiled threat, only a quiet acknowledgement of her mistakes and a tentative hope for a different future. He reread the final paragraph. "Ms. Moreau requests no further contact. She wishes you and your family well." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. A wave of sadness washed over him, a pang of regret for the pain he had inflicted and the pain she had inflicted in return. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and breathed in the scent of the earth, finding a measure of solace in the simple beauty of his new life. The future was uncertain, but it was a future he now faced with a quiet sense of hope. He had lost everything, yet somehow he had gained so much more. The courtroom was cold, a stark contrast to the humid summer air outside. Isabella sat ramrod straight, her usual carefully constructed composure slightly frayed. The muted gray of her prison-issue jumpsuit did little to hide the sharp angles of her face, the haunted look in her eyes. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack echoing in the suffocating silence. The sentence, 8 years, hung heavy in the air, a weight both Isabella and Arthur felt keenly. Later, in the sterile visiting room, Arthur found her. He wasn't there to gloat or even to forgive. He simply needed to understand. The air hummed with unspoken questions, the scent of antiseptic sharp in his nostrils. Isabella looked smaller. Somehow, her defiant spirit dulled by the harsh reality of her situation. I didn't expect you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Arthur sat across from her, the hard plastic chair uncomfortable beneath him. "I needed to see what you'd become," he admitted, his voice low and measured. The years had etched lines onto his face, but the bitterness was gone, replaced by a weary acceptance. "A monster," she said, her eyes filling with unshed tears. "I built a cage around myself, just as I built one for you." Her voice trembled. "Revenge, it's a hollow victory, Arthur. It consumes you, leaving you empty." He nodded, understanding dawning in him. He saw the reflection of his own past in her regret, the bitter taste of self-destruction. My family suffered. Yours did too. We both let our anger control us. I'm sorry, she said. The words a fragile thing. A tentative first step towards redemption. For everything. Arthur looked at her, the hardness in his gaze softening. The years had taught him the price of vengeance, the heavy cost of unforgiveness. I'm sorry too, Isabella, he replied, a weight lifting from his chest. The apology felt like a release, a healing balm on deep-seated wounds. He could see, in the depths of her sorrow, a flicker of the woman she could become. Not the woman who had orchestrated his downfall, but something different, something better. The silence between them was finally filled, not with hatred, but with a profound understanding of shared pain, a common recognition of the destructive power of bitterness, and perhaps a fragile hope for something new. The prison walls seemed to breathe, a damp chill clinging to the faded paint. The visiting room, a sterile box of pale green, hummed with the low thrum of fluorescent lights. Arthur sat opposite Isabella, the plastic chair digging into his thighs. He watched her, her face etched with a weariness that transcended the prison garb. Gone was the sharp, calculated composure. In its place, a fragile vulnerability. The scent of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the air, a bitter counterpoint to the tentative hope blooming in Arthur's heart. 8 years, he murmured, breaking the silence. The words weren't accusatory, just an observation of a harsh reality. Isabella nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The delicate silver ring she always wore, a symbol of her former life, was gone. It feels like a lifetime, she whispered, her voice raspy. I thought revenge would satisfy me, fill the emptiness. He understood. He'd felt that emptiness himself, the hollow ache of a life built on ambition and devoid of genuine connection. The penthouse, the wealth, the power, it had all been a gilded cage. He'd traded his family for a fleeting illusion of happiness, only to find himself utterly alone. It doesn't, Arthur said softly, his voice raspy from disuse. He looked at her, truly saw her, not the calculating enemy, but a woman trapped in the prison of her own making. It leaves you with nothing but regret. A single tear traced a path through the lines on her face, disappearing into the creases near her mouth. I destroyed your life, and mine. Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbling. My father, he wouldn't have wanted this. Arthur reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers for a moment before gently resting on top. The contact was brief, but the weight of shared sorrow and understanding hung heavy between them. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but a shared acknowledgement of the devastation wrought by their actions. We both made mistakes, Isabella, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We both let our anger consume us. He squeezed her hand lightly, a silent testament to a nascent understanding, a fragile seed of reconciliation sprouting in the barren landscape of their shared past. The weight of the past remained, heavy and undeniable, but a faint glimmer of hope, a whisper of redemption, began to fill the sterile silence of the visiting room. The future remained uncertain, a vast and uncharted territory, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a flicker of peace. The courtroom air hung thick with the scent of old wood and anticipation. Isabella, in a simple gray suit, sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the judge. The gavel's sharp crack echoed the finality of her fate, 8 years. The sentence hung in the air, a heavy weight settling on the hushed courtroom. Arthur, watching from the back row, felt a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. Her downfall wasn't a victory for him. It was a shared tragedy. Later, outside the courthouse, the city noise assaulted him, a cacophony of horns and shouting that mirrored the turmoil in his own soul. He leaned against a cool brick wall, the rough texture grounding him in the stark reality of his new life. He'd lost everything: his empire, his penthouse, even the semblance of the man he once was. Yet, something shifted within him. The hollow ache was still there, but it wasn't all-consuming anymore. Months passed. Arthur found a small apartment, a stark contrast to his former opulence. He spent his days volunteering at a homeless shelter, the quiet rhythm of helping others a balm to his wounded spirit. He learned to cook simple meals, the scent of simmering vegetables a comforting presence in his otherwise empty kitchen. He started writing letters to his children, tentative at first, filled with apologies and hesitant words of love. One crisp autumn afternoon, he received a reply. His daughter's handwriting, shaky but determined, filled the page. It wasn't a forgiveness, not yet, but an acknowledgement of his efforts. A tiny crack in the wall of resentment. Hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, fluttered in his chest. He held the letter close, feeling a warmth spread through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the opulence of his past and everything to do with the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding his life. He thought of Isabella. He knew she'd need time, space to confront the devastation she'd wrought. Her revenge had been a Pyrrhic victory, leaving her as empty and broken as him. Perhaps one day, in the quiet aftermath of their shared ruin, they could find a way to acknowledge their mistakes, to acknowledge the shared human pain that drove them both to the brink. The future was uncertain, a path still shrouded in mist, but he no longer felt the paralyzing weight of despair. He had found something far more valuable than wealth, the slow, steady work of redemption. The prison walls were a stark gray, mirroring the bleakness in Isabella's heart. 8 years. The sentence echoed in the hollow chambers of her mind, a relentless hammer against the fragile remnants of her pride. The cold, institutional smell of disinfectant clung to everything, a constant reminder of her confinement. She sat on the hard cot, the rough fabric scratching against her skin, a physical manifestation of the inner turmoil that gnawed at her. A guard's heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, shattering the silence. He slid a tray of food through the slot, tasteless gruel and a piece of stale bread. Isabella barely touched it. Food held no appeal. Neither did anything else anymore. She thought of Arthur. The image that flickered in her mind wasn't the arrogant, successful man she'd known, but the broken, vulnerable one she'd seen in court. His eyes, haunted and hollow, held a sorrow that mirrored her own. Their shared destruction felt less like a victory and more like a tragic dance of self-destruction. A memory surfaced: the opulent penthouse, shimmering under the city lights, a stage for their twisted game. She'd played her part flawlessly, but the victory felt hollow, the triumph tainted by the bitter taste of regret. The elaborate revenge had cost her everything: her freedom, her sense of self, any hope of genuine happiness. One evening, a letter arrived. Her lawyer's neat handwriting announced a visitor. Her father, the man whose death she'd orchestrated, indirectly, through her actions against Arthur. She hadn't seen him since she'd initiated her plan. The thought of seeing him now, filled with a complex mixture of dread and a long-suppressed longing, sent a shiver down her spine. The cold of the cell suddenly felt more intense, a reflection of the icy dread gripping her. She wondered if he'd forgive her. She wondered if she even deserved forgiveness. The answer, she knew, would have to wait, but the small, fragile hope that he would offer some measure of peace offered a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness of her cell. The visiting room was sterile, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and despair. Isabella sat across from her father, a frail man whose eyes held a weary sadness that mirrored her own. Sunlight, filtered through the grimy window, cast long shadows across the table between them. He looked older, ravaged by time and worry, a stark contrast to the powerful businessman she remembered. "Isabella," he began, his voice a raspy whisper. The word hung heavy in the air, laden with unspoken emotions. She swallowed, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. "Father," she replied, her voice barely above a breath. Years of carefully constructed walls crumbled, revealing the vulnerability beneath. He reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly as it touched hers. His touch was surprisingly gentle, devoid of the anger she'd expected. Tears welled in his eyes. I never understood, he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. The extent of your pain, the depth of your anger. Isabella flinched, the memory of her mother's broken spirit, Arthur's callous disregard for her family, flooding back. It wasn't about understanding, father, she whispered, her voice breaking. It was about retribution, about making them pay. And did it make you happy? He asked softly, his gaze unwavering. She looked away, unable to meet his sorrowful eyes. The opulent penthouse, the fleeting sense of power, the hollow victory, all felt insignificant now, dwarfed by the crushing weight of her actions. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. The cold reality of her situation, the 8 years stretched before her, pressed heavily upon her. Yet, in her father's eyes, she saw something unexpected. Compassion, a flicker of forgiveness. No, she finally admitted, the single word a confession of her deepest regret. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent acknowledgement of her failings. The taste of it was bitter, salty, and utterly cleansing. In that sterile room, under the pale sunlight, a fragile seed of hope began to take root, a promise of eventual healing. The long road to redemption still lay ahead, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of light piercing the suffocating darkness. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the opulent penthouse where her revenge had begun. The air hung heavy with the hushed whispers of onlookers, the scent of old wood and polished brass a stark reminder of her past life. Isabella sat rigidly, her tailored suit a shield against the weight of the proceedings. The judge's gavel fell, a sharp crack echoing the shattering of her carefully constructed world. 8 years. 8 years she would spend reflecting on the choices that led her to this sterile, impersonal space. She glanced at her father, seated in the gallery, his face etched with a mixture of sorrow and reluctant acceptance. His gaze, though, held a hint of something else or a fragile hope. Later, in the visiting room, a pale winter sun cast long shadows across the worn table. Arthur sat opposite her, his face lined, his eyes holding a weariness that mirrored her own. He was a shadow of his former self, the arrogance gone, replaced by a quiet humility. The bitterness she'd expected was absent, replaced by a surprising gentleness. He spoke first, his voice a low rumble. I never understood the depth of your pain, Isabella. I was blind. Isabella stared at her hands, her knuckles white as she clenched them. The words felt inadequate, insufficient to cover the years of pain and betrayal. It wasn't about understanding, she finally managed, her voice a fragile whisper. It was about making them pay for what they did to my mother. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring the already dim light. The memory of her mother's frail form, her constant fear, overwhelmed her. She saw her father's pained expression, and her own hollow victory felt as insignificant as dust. But revenge doesn't heal, does it? Arthur's voice was soft, laced with empathy. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. This simple gesture, devoid of judgment, held more weight than any grand declaration. It sparked a flicker of warmth in the icy landscape of her heart. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft sniffles escaping her lips. The weight of her actions settled upon her, crushing but strangely clarifying. She admitted, no, it didn't. She spoke of her mother's memory, of her father's quiet strength, of her own crippling emptiness. The words flowed, washing away years of carefully constructed bitterness. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the profound emptiness of revenge, the devastating cost of her actions. Arthur listened patiently, his quiet presence a beacon in the storm of her emotions. He spoke of his own regrets, of his misguided choices, his abandonment of his family. A shared sorrow, a shared understanding, began to bridge the chasm between them. The sterile visiting room, no longer a symbol of her defeat, transformed into a space of shared grief and tentative forgiveness. The possibility of redemption, though distant, offered a glimmer of hope in the desolate landscape of her heart. The prison library smelled of old paper and dust, a stark contrast to the perfumed opulence of Arthur's former life. Isabella, her face pale and thinner, sat hunched over a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, a cruel irony not lost on her. The rhythmic scratching of her pen against paper was the only sound in the quiet room. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the prison walls in hues of orange and gray. A soft knock startled her. It was Arthur, his hair grayer, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes holding a surprising gentleness. He carried a worn leather-bound book, a collection of poetry her mother had loved. "I thought you might like this," he said, his voice raspy but kind. He placed it gently on the table between them. The scent of old leather and faded ink filled the air, a poignant reminder of a past neither could erase. Isabella looked at the book, then at Arthur. The anger, the bitterness, had begun to recede, leaving behind a vast emptiness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been thinking about what we both did." Arthur began, his gaze fixed on the book. "The hurt we caused. It was senseless." A tear traced a path down Isabella's cheek, leaving a glistening trail. "My mother," she began, her voice choked with emotion. The memory of her mother's fear, her quiet strength in the face of Arthur's father's ruthlessness, overwhelmed her again. Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I understand," he said softly. "I failed my own family, too. We both did terrible things." He paused, then added, "But maybe we can find a way to atone." The weight of their shared guilt hung heavy between them, a silent testament to their past mistakes. Yet, in the quiet of the prison library, a fragile hope began to bloom, a hope born not from denial, but from the acceptance of their shared pain and the quiet, tentative steps towards redemption. The book, a symbol of a shared loss and a possible future, sat between them, a silent witness to a new chapter in their lives, a chapter written not in revenge, but in forgiveness. The visiting room was sterile, the pale green paint chipped and faded. Sunlight, filtered through grimy windows, cast long shadows across the plastic chairs. Arthur sat opposite Isabella, the chasm between them seemingly wider than the prison bars separating her from the outside world. He held a worn photograph, a picture of his family, taken years ago before the bitterness and the betrayal. His children, once distant figures, now seemed heartbreakingly young, their smiles frozen in time. He pushed the photo across the small table. I wanted you to see them," he said, his voice husky with unshed tears. The years had etched lines on his face, replacing the arrogant confidence with a weary acceptance. Isabella looked at the photograph, her eyes tracing the contours of his children's faces. A flicker of something akin to regret, a ghost of the girl she once was, briefly touched her expression before hardening again. The prison had aged her, but hadn't softened the sharp edges of her resolve. "They don't know," she said, her voice low and tight. "They still think I'm someone else." "They'll know," Arthur replied gently. "Eventually, but I wanted them to see you, to understand, not to excuse what you did, but to see the person behind the revenge." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And for you to see them, to remember why all of this happened." Silence hung heavy between them, punctuated only by the distant clang of a metal door. The weight of their shared past pressed down, a suffocating blanket of guilt and regret. Yet, amidst the despair, a fragile thread of understanding began to weave its way through the tangled tapestry of their lives. The sterile room seemed less cold, the shadows less menacing. The photograph, a simple token, bridged the divide between them, a silent testament to the enduring power of family and the possibility of forgiveness. The air, thick with unspoken words, gradually started to clear, hinting at a long road ahead, yet filled with a glimmer of hope. The bitter taste of revenge was slowly yielding to a more profound and lasting need, the need for reconciliation and peace. The courtroom was a stifling box of polished wood and hushed whispers. Isabella, in a stark gray suit, sat ramrod straight, her face a mask of controlled composure. The judge's gavel, a sharp crack in the suffocating silence, punctuated the finality of her sentence. 5 years, a fraction of the pain she'd inflicted, a mere blip in the long arc of Arthur's suffering. Yet, as the bailiff led her away, a subtle tremor ran through her rigid posture. The carefully constructed walls of her revenge crumbled, revealing a flicker of something akin to fear, not of imprisonment, but of the emptiness that awaited her. The victory was hollow, the taste of revenge as bitter as she'd always known it would be. Later, in a sparsely furnished visitor's room, Arthur sat across from his eldest daughter, Emily. The years had etched worry lines around her eyes, but her smile, when she finally spoke, held a fragile warmth. "Dad," she began, her voice catching slightly, I don't know what to say. What happened was terrible, but seeing you here, trying, it means something." The scent of old paper and stale coffee hung in the air, a stark contrast to the opulent penthouse where he'd once lived a life of gilded misery. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the woman she'd become, bearing the scars of his absence, and felt the crushing weight of his past choices. "I know," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "and I'm so sorry." The following months were a slow, painstaking process of rebuilding. Arthur found solace in volunteering at a homeless shelter, his hands roughened by manual labor, a stark contrast to the manicured perfection of his former life. He wrote letters to his children, long, heartfelt letters filled with regret and a desperate plea for forgiveness. He started small, offering a helping hand, listening, truly listening to their hurt and anger. He began to understand that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the strength of human connection. One crisp autumn afternoon, he found himself at Emily's wedding. He stood at the back of the church, watching her walk down the aisle, radiant in her simple white dress. The sunlight streaming through stained glass windows painted the scene in hues of hope and forgiveness. He saw in her eyes not only the pain of the past but also a hesitant acceptance. The bitter taste of revenge had faded, replaced by the quiet sweetness of reconciliation. And in that moment, amidst the gentle murmur of prayers and the soft strains of wedding music, Arthur knew that his own long journey toward redemption was finally complete. The prison visiting room smelled of disinfectant and despair. Isabella, pale and thinner, sat across from her father, his face etched with a grief that mirrored her own, though hers was laced with a bitter self-awareness. He hadn't visited often, the shame too heavy to bear. He tried to explain, to apologize, but his words felt hollow even to his own ears. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the muted hum of the fluorescent lights. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of regret, but of a profound loneliness that had settled deep in her bones. Arthur reached across the small, worn table, his hand hovering over hers before dropping back. The gesture, though hesitant, held a weight of unspoken understanding. He saw the emptiness behind the carefully constructed anger, the same emptiness he'd carried for so long. "Revenge is a hollow victory, Isabella," he said softly, his voice rough but kind. "It consumes you, leaves you with nothing but ashes." His words weren't an accusation, but a shared confession, a recognition of their mutual destruction. She nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The carefully crafted facade, the icy mask of revenge, had finally cracked, revealing a vulnerable woman consumed by her actions. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken regrets and the fragile hope of a future they had both almost destroyed. The clock ticked, each second a reminder of the time lost, the relationships shattered, the lives irrevocably altered. Yet, in the shared sorrow, a flicker of understanding ignited, a fragile ember of healing in the desolate landscape of their broken lives. The visit ended, leaving behind the lingering scent of regret and the faint possibility of forgiveness, a fragile promise whispered in the hushed quiet of the visiting room. The courtroom was stifling, the air thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat. Isabella, dressed in a simple gray suit, sat rigidly, her gaze fixed on the judge. The gavel's final thud echoed in the silence, a definitive end to a chapter of her life. Guilt, sharp and insistent, gnawed at her. The sentence, 5 years, felt both lenient and crippling. 5 years to confront the emptiness her revenge had left behind. Later, in the stark visiting room of the correctional facility, a different kind of silence prevailed. Arthur sat opposite her, the lines on his face softened by time, his eyes holding a quiet understanding. He'd visited regularly, not to gloat, but to offer a fragile olive branch. I'm sorry," Isabella said, the words catching in her throat. The meticulously crafted facade of her past year had crumbled, replaced by a raw vulnerability. Arthur nodded slowly. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "We both made mistakes, Isabella. Terrible ones." He reached across the small table, his hand covering hers. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness, not yet, but of shared pain, a recognition of their mutual destruction. The following months unfolded in a quiet rhythm. Arthur continued his efforts to rebuild his relationships with his family, his remorse a palpable presence in their tentative reunions. He found solace in simple things, helping his daughter with her college applications, reading bedtime stories to his youngest son, sharing quiet dinners with his wife, the unspoken resentment slowly melting under the weight of shared grief and rediscovered love. Isabella's time behind bars wasn't a period of wallowing, but of introspection. She started attending counseling sessions, confronting the deep-seated anger that had fueled her actions. She began writing, pouring her regrets and self-awareness into the pages of a journal, finding a cathartic release in words. She discovered a talent for writing, a way to connect with others, a path that lay outside the bitter cycle of revenge. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur sat on a park bench, the scent of fallen leaves filling the air. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, as his daughter skipped towards him, a vibrant splash of color against the muted browns of the landscape. He saw a reflection of his own healing, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In his heart, a quiet acceptance settled, a peace that transcended material wealth. He'd lost so much, yet he'd gained something profoundly more valuable: the chance to rebuild his life and make amends, brick by fragile brick. The future held no guarantees, but it held the possibility of forgiveness, the possibility of love, and the quiet dignity of a second chance. He looked up at the sky, a sense of serene gratitude washing over him. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined him. He'd found peace, not in oblivion, but in the painstaking process of acceptance and genuine redemption. The prison walls, cold and gray, seemed to mirror the chill in Isabella's heart. 5 years. 5 years to contemplate the wreckage of her revenge. The legal proceedings had been a blur, a stark contrast to the meticulously planned life she'd orchestrated. Now, the silence of her cell pressed down, heavy and suffocating. She picked up her pen, the worn wood smooth beneath her fingers, and began to write, the scratching of the nib a small rebellion against the crushing weight of her solitude. Arthur's visits were a surprising balm. He didn't condemn, didn't preach. He simply sat, his presence a quiet acknowledgement of their shared ruin. His eyes, once cold and distant, now held a weary compassion that softened the harsh lines of his face. One afternoon he brought a book, a worn copy of Anna Karenina. "I thought you might appreciate it," he said, his voice low. The gesture, small as it was, spoke volumes. It was an unspoken apology, a bridge across the chasm of their bitterness. Their conversations were hesitant at first, punctuated by silences thick with unspoken regret. Gradually, though, a fragile understanding bloomed. They spoke of their families, their pasts, their mistakes. Isabella, stripped bare of her carefully constructed persona, confessed her fear, her loneliness, the unexpected emptiness of her victory. Arthur listened, his own remorse a palpable presence in the air between them. He spoke of his renewed relationship with his children, the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding trust, of forgiveness. He spoke of his new life, a simple life, but one filled with purpose. One day, a letter arrived, a short, simple note from his daughter. He read it aloud to Isabella, his voice trembling slightly. It was an invitation to her college graduation ceremony. Isabella's breath hitched. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, unshed for years. This tiny act of kindness, this quiet gesture of acceptance, was more powerful than any judge's gavel, more profound than any prison sentence. It was the first seed of hope in the barren landscape of her despair. The future remained uncertain, clouded by the consequences of her actions. But in that small, sterile room, a fragile sense of peace began to take root. A tentative forgiveness that bloomed in the shared silence between two broken people, slowly healing.